Keras, Guardians of Hades Romance Series, Book Number 7, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Eric G. Dove. Chapter 21. Keras drew on the shadows around the garden as he tugged his clothes on and Enyo dressed, seeking the source of the disturbance as his senses came back online, the calm he had felt in her arms dissipating. Enyo finished dressing and looked at him. "I have a problem." He glanced at her. She looked down at her feet and color climbed her cheeks. Her boots? It hit him. Her underwear. She fidgeted with the slats of her skirt, and he didn't miss how she exposed far too much creamy skin as she did that, or how awkward she was about the fact she was bare beneath her armor. Keras dispatched his shadows, sending them on the hunt, and strode to his dresser. He pulled out a pair of black trunks and felt a little awkward himself as he turned to her and offered them. "It's all I have unless I ask one of the women." He trailed off as he thought about Enyo fighting in the sort of underwear his brother's females probably wore. "These are perfect." She snatched the trunks from him and pulled them on. He tried not to stare at her hips as he thought about the fact she was wearing his underwear. He wasn't sure which was more distracting, the thought of her in sexy lingerie or the thought of her wearing something intimate of his. It became insignificant as his shadows came into contact with the demons, and he counted close to 100 of them. His focus shifted entirely to the matter at hand when one of the wards went down. "Damn it." He grabbed Enyo's hand and pulled her with him, racing along the covered walkway towards the main room of the house. His brothers were all gathered there. "A ward went down," Ares said, and he nodded, confirming he had felt it too. "You think the Fury got her hands on our blood at the gate in Tokyo, or when you guys went to Hong Kong?" Callistos looked from him to Diamond and then Ares, Merrick, and Valen. Keras nodded again. "I had hoped she hadn't, but—" He cut himself off as he felt another ward go down. "Shit," Valen muttered and scrubbed at his violet hair as he pulled Ava closer, a worried edge to his golden eyes as he glanced at her. "We switched them out. We should be safe." Merrick shook his head. "Meadow has blood from the Wraith and his blade. It's possible she found a way to use that blade and our blood to see our memories." "A spell," Cass murmured, and then her voice gained strength as she stepped forwards, her long black dress flowing around her ankles. "She must have more than one witch. It would explain why she didn't care about losing the one in Hong Kong." "Well, fuck," Cal grumbled and reached for Miranda's hand. The Fury's eyes shone bright purple as she stared out into the garden. Cal squeezed her hand and her gaze snapped to him. "We're all good, baby." She nodded. Diamond muttered a ripe curse. A third ward had just gone down. The ground shook again, trembled so violently that one of the wooden posts cracked and dust rained down from the roof. Keras stilled as he sensed it. The Fury, and her 3 bodyguards. He strode to the front door and opened it, stared at the white wall that surrounded the mansion, and waited. This time it was the huge wooden gates that shook. The enemy had penetrated the wards. "Cass," Diamond hollered, "a little help?" She brushed past Keras and held her hands up. Light glowed from her palms as she muttered words, growing brighter and brighter until it was blinding. It shot from her hands and detonated around 80 feet above her, cascaded downwards to form a dome that fizzled out just beyond the gatehouse. "That is not good." Cass looked at him, her pale blue eyes showing concern. "They must have another witch." As she said that, the hole in the shimmering blue dome grew larger, as if the spell had been put in reverse. She frowned at it. "That is really not good." She built another spell and released it, this one a smaller dome that only encompassed the house and some of the grounds. "It will not hold for long if they do have witches." She didn't sound confident that it would hold at all. She grimaced and held her hands out in front of her. "I will try to maintain it." Milos came and wound around her legs, and she glanced down at the cat and nodded. The deity remained at her side, together with Diamond, as Ares, Merrick, and Valen stormed into the garden, approaching the edge of the barrier. "Cal," Keras said, stopping his youngest brother in his tracks. When Cal looked at him, he added, "I need you to remain inside with Aiko, Ava, and Miranda. Someone has to protect them and Escher." Cal frowned at him. "I will do it." Enyo stepped up to him, and Keras wanted to argue but settled for nodding when steely resolve shone in her jade eyes. Enyo was strong, capable. If anyone could protect Escher and the others, it was her. He nodded, pulled her to him, and kissed her, and strode forwards, past Cass and Diamond to join the rest of his brothers. Katerina fell into line beside Merrick, a silver blade gripped tightly in her right hand, her caramel hair twisted into a knot at the back of her head. A black t-shirt and dark blue jeans molded to her lean frame, making her blend with his brother as Merrick closed ranks with her and flicked her a worried glance. Keras would ensure nothing happened to the hybrid, but he wasn't about to turn down her assistance. "Do you think the Fury wants her witch back, or does she want the bodies of the fallen?" Cass already sounded tired. Valen hollered, "Either way, shit doesn't look good." Just as he said that, the heavy wooden gates burst open, flying off their hinges, one of them shattering under the force of the blow the demon had directed at it. The horned brute lumbered forwards, his black wings twitching as he narrowed crimson eyes on Keras, grinned to flash long white daggers. Pandemonium broke out, lightning arcing from the sky as spears of baked earth shot up from the ground. The trio of demons dodged every white-purple bolt, leaped backwards to avoid Merrick's attack too, giving his brother what he wanted. A thick wall formed before them. An axe shattered it, sending shards of clay flying everywhere. They rained down on the barrier, bouncing off it, followed by the demon. He struck it so hard that the air trembled. Cass grunted. Diamond cursed. "Do something about them." Keras gathered his shadows and launched them at the males, growling when they proved again that they were faster than their size made them appear. They lifted off as one, rising into the air, and nimbly strafing to one side as his shadows snapped and lashed at them. More demons poured into the grounds, surrounding the barrier, clawing and punching it. Behind him, Cass muttered something in Russian. "You're doing great, baby," Diamond murmured softly. She snapped at him. "Just do something about them." I shot up on the other side of the barrier, impaling several of the demons. But where one fell, two more climbed over the body to continue the assault on the barrier. There were too many. Merrick and Katerina fought as one, working with Callistos to defend the north side of the garden. Valen and Ares moved to his right to defend the south. Keras stood his ground in the middle, facing the gatehouse, conducting his shadows, pleasure building inside him as they ripped through the weaker demons in their pursuit of the larger males. He grinned as he managed to snag the ankle of one of the demonic brutes, yanked him out of the air, and slammed him into the barrier. Bright blue glyphs shimmered across his skin, and light chased over the dome. "Not helping," Cass gritted. "I do not think it will hold much long. West, they're behind us." Keras snarled and stepped there, and growled again as Enyo joined him. "I told you to look after my brother and the others." His mood only darkened when he caught sight of Mirinda hurrying from the house, rushing to join Callistos. "I am protecting them. You cannot do this alone. There are too many of them." She drew her blade from the air and lowered it in front of her, rolled her shoulders and narrowed her eyes on the swarm of demons pouring over the high wall. She was right. There were too many of them. It didn't stop him from fighting. His shadows shot up from the bushes and paths of the garden and twined around as many of them as he could manage. They screamed as his shadows tightened their hold, squeezing the life from them, turning their skin a sickly shade of gray as they devoured them, fed on them, made him stronger. He lashed out again, only this time he didn't need to summon his shadows on the other side of the barrier, because it went down. In a bright flicker of blue light, it was gone. Enyo roared a battle cry as she launched into the fray, not missing a beat, her sword's swift justice to anyone who tried to cross the line where the barrier had curved around the garden. He focused on the others, tearing through any she left alive and injuring others, weakening them for her to finish off. Maybe they did stand a chance. That feeling died as two portals appeared and 4 huge males stepped out of them, their heavy boots hitting the ground with a thud that he felt as he stared at them. They rolled their necks and shook their heads, and wings grew from their backs as their eyes blazed crimson and horns curled from their foreheads. "There are more of them?" Enyo flicked him a worried glance. "Apparently so." Keras reevaluated his tactics, launched all his shadows at these newcomers, growled when he met with the same result as he had with the others. The moment his shadows struck them, glyphs shimmered over their skin. 3 powerful demons of this breed, and with this protection spell inscribed on them, had been troublesome enough. 7 was a problem. The 16 in total he could now sense on the battlefield had him switching tactics again, because even he could see when the odds were against him. Against them. Escher was still unconscious, vulnerable. Aiko and Ava were in danger, even with Valen and Ares having fallen back to protect them. He thanked the gods Ares had taken Megan to the underworld. He pressed his hand to Enyo's stomach and forced her back with him, keeping his gaze and his senses fixed on the 4 demons advancing on them through the garden, trampling everything in their path. Anger burned up his blood, born not only of the violation of his territory by these wretches, but from what he needed to do. He crossed the Vermilion Bridge and glanced off to his left, past the wing of the house and beyond the Zen garden to Merrick and Katerina, where they fought a group of demons, battling to reach the smaller building where they had stored the bodies of the Wraith and the other Fury. Bodies he had used as bait and now regretted it. "Stop!" he shouted to Merrick. Merrick tossed a female demon aside and turned to look at him. Satisfied that his brother and Katerina weren't in the firing line, Keras launched his shadows at the building, gathering more along the way, pushing himself to the limit and pouring his strength into them and the attack. The swirling mass of shadows struck the building, obliterated it. When they parted, falling away as quickly as they had engulfed it, all that was left was rubble and scattered pieces of everything it had contained. A high, keening shriek slashed through the cool night air. Keras's strength bled from him as Meadow screamed again, her rage a palpable thing as pieces of the building fluttered down from the sky. Enyo caught him, supporting his weight with an arm around his waist and keeping him on his feet. He looked at the battle and knew what he needed to do. They couldn't fight here. As much as he wanted to end the Fury, taking advantage of the pain she was experiencing and using the weakness her rage caused against her, as much as he hated the thought of her side winning any battle, this one was a loss for his side. He turned towards his brothers where they all continued to fight, struggling to protect their home, their loved ones. "Evacuate, now!" he bellowed. Everyone looked at him. Diamond grabbed Cass, who lunged for a transformed Mr. Milos, managing to get a hand on the winged lion a heartbeat before his brother whisked her away. "Go!" Keras looked at Ares. Ares nodded and ran for Aiko, bundled her up in his arm, and raced for Escher's room. Valen and Ava were hot on his heels. Merrick disappeared with Katerina. "Mari, we have to go!" Cal called, and Keras looked for her. His gaze swept back to the Zen garden. Marinda clashed hard with her Fury half-sister, her eyes bright violet, her golden hair falling loose from the braid that arched over the top of her head as she grappled with Meadow. Meadow hissed in her face and smashed a fist into her jaw, sent Marinda staggering backwards. Cal hit Meadow with a blast of wind that caught her off guard and sent her flying into the wall near the remains of the building where they had stored the bodies. He ran for Marinda. Meadow was back on her feet in a flash, a vicious snarl peeling from her lips as she spotted him racing toward Marinda. The 16 demonic males Keras had sensed in the area dropped from the sky, forming a wall of muscle between Cal and Marinda. Keras teleported, appearing next to Cal, grabbing his arm and pulling him back just in time. The blade one of the males had aimed at him sliced across his chest rather than his neck, ripping a cry from his youngest brother. Keras twisted with him and slammed his fist into the male's gut, grimaced as pain shot up his arm and shoved forwards, unleashing his shadows at the same time. His head turned as they burst from him, as they engulfed the male and lashed at the 2 nearest him, but failed to hurt them. On the other side of the wall of demons, Marinda hissed and attacked Meadow, lost in her fury hungers. She wasn't going to retreat. Their only hope was reaching her. Enyo teleported into the fray, appearing on the other side of the demons. She made it a few steps towards the Fury before one of the males tackled her, slamming her into the white gravel. Keras roared and tossed the demon his shadows had surrounded aside, hurling him at the one who had Enyo pinned, sending him flying off her. She scrambled onto her feet and sprinted forwards. Meadow delivered a punishing blow to Marinda's face. Marinda cried out as her head whipped to her left, as blood sprayed from her lips, and threw a stricken look at Callistos. Cal growled as the Fury seized hold of her and a portal formed behind her. His brother stepped and lunged for Mari's hand as she twisted towards him, reaching for him, and Enyo barreled towards her too. Keras's heart seized as he realized she wasn't aiming for Miranda. She was aiming for Meadow. She would be pulled through Meadow's portal too, captured by his enemy. A demon collared Callistos and yanked him backwards just as he was about to grab Miranda's hand, and his brother unleashed an agonized bellow as Meadow pulled her into the portal. Keras swept his hand out, and his shadow struck at the male holding Callistos, dislodging the demon and freeing his brother, an attack that cost him as his head turned and his knees gave out. Enyo skidded to a halt on the gravel and pivoted to face him, her jade eyes wide, filled with fear. Callistos kicked off, reaching for the portal. Too late. It closed before his brother could reach it. Cal turned wild, stormy eyes on the remaining demons, and a tornado tore through the garden as he roared, ripping across the Zen garden and coming close to striking the house. Keras grabbed his brother and Enyo and stepped, collapsed in a heap on the slate floor of the dark wood-clad vestibule of the castle in Scotland. Wind battered the ancient dark stone walls, rattled the arched leaded windows, and blew out a few of the panes. Snow whipped against the building, and waves lashed the shore of the small rocky island. "Cal!" Ares hurried to him, sank to his knees, and gathered him into his arms, holding him even as he struggled, trying to break free as he growled and snarled, twisting violently in Ares' arms. "What happened?" Keras didn't have the strength to speak and answer that question. Not yet. All he could do was breathe and focus on maintaining control as darkness curled through his veins, growing stronger by the second, taking advantage of his weakness. He battled it in silence, waging a war he feared he was going to lose as everything that had happened replayed in his mind, as he thought about the mansion and how he had been forced to flee from his own damned stronghold. "The other Fury," Enyo said, and he was grateful to her for taking command. "Miranda was fighting her, and Callistos tried to get through to her, but she was taken." Darkness swamped the room, the tinny scent of magic flooding it, provoking the darkness within him. He curled his fingers into tight fists as his nails became claws, as the voice within him whispered tempting things about making the witch fight him. She wanted to fight. He wanted it too. Spill blood, split flesh, break bone. The hunger to surrender to that need was overwhelming. "Taken?" Cass snapped, fury lacing that word, black malevolence that poured off her. Outside, the afternoon grew dark, verging on pitch black. Not Cass's doing, his. Enyo's gaze came to rest on him, a warm caress that chased some of the shadows from his heart and his mind. He couldn't bring himself to look at her as he fought the darker side of himself, as he denied the urges running unchecked through him, a terrible need for violence that he feared would turn on her if he so much as glanced at her. He didn't want to fight her. He didn't want to goad her into hitting him. He didn't want to turn that fight into foreplay, using it to heighten the pleasure he would feel as he sank himself inside her welcoming body again. She moved a step closer, her presence a light that drove the darkness back, but it still writhed within him, pushing to the surface even as he forced it back down. He kept his eyes fixed on the witch, refusing to surrender to the darkness, even when other images flashed across his mind, fragmented memories of holding Enyo against him, her back to his front, and his fangs poised against the smooth column of her neck. Gods, the desire that surged through him stole his breath as he fell into that memory, flooded him with a need to mark her like that, to sink his fangs into her flesh and hold her in place as he took her, as he claimed her. He shook his head, dislodging that memory and denying that need, dragging himself back to the present. For a moment, Keras felt sure Cass would use a spell to return to the mansion, or lash out at his brother. The vicious expression etched on her face slowly faded as she breathed, as her eyes turned from bright silver to ice blue. As Diamond came to her and took hold of her hand, she looked at him, her face crumpling. "We'll get Mari back," Diamond said, belief ringing in his voice. Keras looked at all his brothers, at their women, and pushed back against the darkness, denying it and clawing himself back towards the light. He mustered his strength and managed to pick himself up off the floor, stood with effort that had his muscles clamping down hard on his bones. He refused to give in to the weakness rushing through him, refused to surrender to the darkness or the insidious voice that murmured sweetly in his ear, speaking of his pills. Because his family needed a leader now more than ever. They needed hope. The enemy need Miranda alive. He sagged a little, hoped his brothers wouldn't notice how weak he was and how much of a struggle it was to remain upright as they all looked at him. He pushed the words out. We will have a chance to get her back. He reached for Callistos, placed his hand against the back of his head, funneled the compulsion to sleep into him before he could do anything, almost followed his brother into the darkness. Ennio caught him, keeping him upright, lending him her strength. Was that really necessary? Cass looked from Cal to him. It was, Diamond answered her before Keras could gather the energy to do it. Cal was getting too worked up. There was a danger he might pass out, and the gods only know how long he would be asleep if that happened. This way he can rest while we come up with a plan. Valen lifted Escher from the cold stone floor and jerked his head to his left as Iko glanced at him. I'll show you to his room. Ava followed them as they disappeared into the small hallway that adjoined the large foyer and banked right. Ares stood, taking Cal with him, cradling him gently as he looked down at Keras. You okay? Keras nodded. Get him comfortable. I'll get the boiler running. Merrick turned away from them, leading Katerina to the hallway and taking a right too. Only Keras knew he was heading down into the basement with her rather than up to the first floor. His brother's deep voice faded into the distance as he said, You can check on your brother while we're down here. Katerina's brother had been turned into a wraith, his transformation completed by Eli, the wraith who had been on the enemy's side. Guillaume had pledged his allegiance to that side too, but Merrick's latest reports on Katerina's efforts to reach her brother and turn him to their side were positive. Guillaume had started giving them information, showed signs that he wanted to go back to his old life with his sister. Keras wasn't sure how much of it was a desperate act to save himself, since he had been locked in the basement cells for months now. He thought about the other source of information they were holding down there. A need to force her to talk in case she knew where the fury might have taken Miranda filled him. Pain ripped through him and he doubled over as he gasped, as he wrapped his arms around his stomach and gritted his teeth. His stomach twisted violently, hunger swamping him as feelings collided inside him, forming a maelstrom that swept him up in it, had him spinning out of control just as he had thought he had pulled himself together. Fear and anger crashed together, blurred with the bitter disappointment of having to withdraw from the Tokyo mansion, the self-loathing of losing a battle, the dark need to bite Ennio and claim her. He screwed his eyes shut and struggled to breathe as they all rushed through him, rousing a terrible urge to return to the Tokyo mansion and fight. Cold sweat rolled down his spine beneath his shirt. His entire body quaked and his breath stuttered. Shadows whipped around him, moving faster and faster as he spiraled downwards, into the mire of his feelings, drowning in them. Light breached the darkness, her touch whisper soft. He leaned into that caress as it chased over his right cheek, seeking the warmth of it, the steadiness as his entire world tilted wrong way up, and he felt as if he was falling. You should not have teleported so many when you were weak. Her soft, chastising words roused the dark beast inside him, had him seething with a need to lash out at her for calling him weak. He battled it, conquered it, and sank into her touch instead, seeking the comfort of it. She took hold of him, gently pulled him up onto his feet, and helped him into an adjoining room. She set him down on the hard antique couch and kneeled before him, stroking her fingers over his brow. Is he all right? Valen's voice was low, filled with worry that was unlike his brother. Things had to be bad if Valen's bravado had slipped, revealing the heart he insisted on hiding from the world. He will be. Ennio feathered her fingers down Keras's cheek. He will be. He appreciated the conviction in her tone, clawed together the strength it instilled in him, the belief that the emotions bombarding him would pass if he could just hold it together. He wasn't going to drown in them. He didn't need a pill. He had pulled himself together a few minutes ago, and he could pull himself together now. A mocking voice inside him asked if he believed that. He didn't. He did. The suddenness and the strength of the episode had caught him off guard. That was the only reason he was doubting whether he could make it through it. He could. Other voices joined Valen and Enyo's, a blur of them that it hurt to focus on, so he focused on himself instead, on slowly picking apart the wretched mash of his feelings and processing them one by one. Eventually, his head cleared enough that the conversation came into focus. What if we took another look at Guillem's mind? Diamond's words were met with the sound of feet scuffing the stone floor and a muffled grunt. Keras cracked his eyes open, squinted across the room to the arched stone doorway, where Katerina had Diamond pinned against the wooden panels that covered the walls. Or maybe not, Diamond muttered and raised his hands at his sides. Pointless. Keras shoved that word from his lips with effort, and everyone looked at him. Cannot. If he was going to crack open anyone's mind for answers, it would be the witches he probed. Aiko could. Valen shrugged when Keras frowned at him. Aiko was a carrier, with the talent of reading intentions in people, and sometimes their minds. But Guillem was strong and might block her. The last thing Keras needed was Aiko hurting herself trying to read his memories, and Escher finally coming around to find her recovering from it. Escher was going to be angry enough as it was. Keras wasn't sure what condition the enemy would leave the Tokyo mansion in. There was nothing of importance stored there. Keras had made sure of that only a month ago, when Callistos had first used his favor mark to summon a portal to the underworld so he could report to their father. He had made Callistos take all their swords and shields with him. Merrick had kept every scrap of information they had on his computer, and Keras had no doubt that his brother had evacuated that item from the mansion too. His brother would never leave his beloved laptop behind. There might be a few documents left there and their clothes, but that was all. I can force the witch to speak. Keras held his hand up when everyone looked as if they might protest. It didn't stop Enyo. No, you are not strong enough right now. You are being reckless. Reckless. He kept being called that recently. The look she gave him said it wasn't like him, and he had to admit that she was right. He was being reckless, letting his emotions rule him when he should have been following a more logical path. You're going to rest, Ares huffed, as he preened the overlong lengths of his tawny hair back and secured it with a leather thong. He folded his arms across his chest and frowned down at his black t-shirt when his muscles flexing caused one of the small tears in it to grow longer. We all are. Today we take a moment. Take stock. Think shit through. Then we'll come up with a plan. Don't give me that look. Keras wanted to deny he was giving his brother a look, but he couldn't wipe it from his face. It wasn't like Ares to think things through and be the one to recommend coming up with a plan. Valen slapped Ares on the back, jerking him forwards and earning himself a glare. Look who's all grown up and mature-like. Never thought I'd see the day when you chose careful, meticulous planning over flexing your muscles and going with the flow. Ares took hold of Valen's hand, removed it from his shoulder, and shoved it away from him. Well, I can safely say we'll never see the day it happens to you. Valen's golden eyes narrowed on him. I'm mature. Ava stifled a giggle, froze when he glared at her, too. No sex for you. Valen crossed his arms over his chest and tipped his chin up, and his head slightly away from Ava as he closed his eyes. Her shoulders slumped beneath her crisp black t-shirt, and she sighed, and somewhat reluctantly fussed over him, speaking to him in Italian. Keras shut them out and focused on the brothers that would be of use to him, and realized that Cass was nowhere to be seen. He looked at Diamond. Where's the witch? My witch or the... Diamond looked around him, and his ice-blue eyes snapped back to Keras. I think my witch is with the witch. A scream shattered the air, had everyone twisting towards the arched doorway to the vestibule. Diamond was first out of the door. He banked left on the other side of it. Enyo helped Keras onto his feet, and he hurried after his brother with her help. The urge to step flooding him as magic rushed through the castle, had the ground shaking beneath his bare feet. He guided her left when they reached the vestibule, quickening his pace as they neared the hallway. He pushed forwards into a shadowy area of the wide corridor. She went for the mahogany staircase that led upwards. Keras pulled her back and released her as he gripped the stone wall and the central pillar of the spiral staircase that led downwards into the rock. Have you lost your fucking mind? Diamond snapped, his voice echoing along the narrow corridor that came into view as Keras reached the bottom step. Enyo seized hold of him again as soon as there was enough room, helped him as he moved as quickly as he could manage, banking right at the wall. Diamond stood a few meters along the corridor, beyond a stunned-looking Katerina, where she leaned with her back plastered against the damp stone wall. The overhead lights flickered as the ground shook again. Keras couldn't believe his eyes when he reached his brother. Cassandra kneeled on the floor of the cell beside the one they were holding Guillem in, an intricate circle shining on the flagstones in front of her. Smaller circles formed a pattern inside it, together with runes and glyphs. Some shone violet and others were blue or green, and the lines that contained them glowed crimson and orange. "What are you doing?" Keras snapped. His green eyes leaped from Cassandra to the red-headed witch kneeling in the middle of the circle, her eyes dull as she stared straight ahead of her, her body unmoving. Cassandra leaned forwards and pressed her palms to the floor, close to the edge of the circle, her raven hair falling from her shoulders to brush her arms and obscure her face. The light of the circle glowed brighter. "Giving myself a boost," Cass muttered, her Russian accent thick as she labored for breath. "Needed to find Mari." He stopped midway through reaching for Diamond, intending to push him aside so he could stop her from killing the witch by draining her. The magic in the air grew denser, and he swore it was invading him too as his head turned. Diamond shook his head and pushed him back, following him to a safer distance, where the power that was building no longer felt as if it was sucking the strength from him too. He sensed everyone else behind him, felt how on edge they were as they waited, as on edge as he was. Could Cass find Miranda? If she could, then there was a chance she could lead him to Meadow, to one of the enemy strongholds. Power hit him like a shock wave, knocking him back into Enyo. Cass screamed. Diamond lunged into the cell. Keras hurried after him, stopped on the threshold and stared at his white-haired brother where he sat with Cassandra tucked in his arms. Fear etched on his face and his eyes dangerously white as he looked down at her. "Cass, wake up, baby." Diamond gently jostled her. Frost flowers bloomed on his black leather gloves. He went to release her. Her nose wrinkled as she frowned and quietly murmured, Don't let go." He held her closer instead of releasing her, his brow furrowing as he lifted one hand and stroked her cheek, caught a tear that rolled down her pale skin. It turned to glittering ice on his gloves. Her eyes fluttered open, filled with despair and hopelessness. She croaked, "I can't find Mari anywhere." "Maybe they cloaked her?" Diamond caressed her face, his effort to reassure her doing nothing to stop her tears as they fell. Another possibility hit Keras like a thunderbolt, chilled him like ice. He looked at his brothers. "Maybe they are no longer in the mortal world." Chapter 22. Enyo grumbled something as she teleported with him to Mount Olympus, probably something about the fact that upon waking in the bed they shared in the castle in Scotland, he had announced they were going to try to find where the enemy had taken Miranda. Keras had rested for a day, felt strong enough to head out into the world now. He couldn't wait any longer, sitting around the castle, leaving Miranda out there. Cal would wake soon, and he wanted to give his brother good news, not let him down by telling him the Fury still had the woman he loved. The light of Olympus hurt his tired eyes, bright sunshine that beat down on him and heated his black shirt and hair. He squinted at the city that filled every inch of the gently sloping base of the mountain, his gaze scanning the terracotta rooftops of the ancient white buildings. Cypresses lined the broad street that cut through the heart of the city, providing shade for the denizens who strolled along the road, stopping at some of the stalls that spilled out onto it near the harbor. Olympus had always been too bright for him. It suited Enyo, though. Warm light caressed her golden skin as she peered at the people passing them by, softened her jade eyes as she lifted them towards the point where the mountain grew steeper. A glimmer of something he didn't like flitted across them as her gaze fixed on one building in particular, and he glowered at the columned temple that stood on a huge pale plateau of rock, looming over the buildings clustered around it. A leafy green garden filled the space to the left of the complex of buildings, and guards patrolled the grounds, the sunlight that glinted off their golden armor revealing them to Keras despite the distance between him and the home of Ares, god of war. Enyo's brother. Enyo's home. She turned away from it and busied herself with plaiting her fall of dark hair, twisting the braid into a knot at the back of her head, and securing it with a pin she pulled from the side of her skirt. A silver pin he had given to her. "I thought you would have thrown that tatty old thing away a long time ago." He echoed the words she had said to him when she had noticed the ring he still wore on his thumb. She stilled and looked at him, her eyes brightening as a smile emerged, curling lips he had kissed, lips he ached to kiss again. "I would not part with it for anything," she murmured, her smile widening, making him want to kiss her even more. He would have, but they were being watched, not only by the patrons who moved between the wooden stalls that lined the buildings along the harbor, but by the guards who stood before the gate behind him, a gate that led to the mortal world. Keras dragged himself away from Enyo and thoughts of kissing her, and settled his mind on business rather than pleasure. Cass had tried the spell again this morning in case she had been mistaken, and the reason she hadn't been able to locate Miranda was because she hadn't had enough power to cast the net wide enough. She had almost killed the witch by drawing on her magic again, using it to fuel the spell together with her own magic, and had met with the same result. Miranda was no longer in the mortal world. Keras had decided there and then that they needed to speak with the guards who protected the only gate the Fury could have possibly passed through, a gate that had remained open to traffic. He turned to four males dressed in golden armor that was molded like muscles over their chest and hung in pointed slats from their waist, over a royal blue skirt. The gold Corinthian helmets they wore covered most of their faces, revealing only their eyes and a sliver of their cheeks, together with their mouths. They flanked the vertical gate, two on either side, their long spears held proudly at their sides as their dark gazes remained fixed straight ahead. "Have you had much traffic through the gate this past day?" Keras looked them over, trying to discern which was the leader. A male to his right answered, "Several parties have entered or exited the city. I am not at liberty to discuss such matters with you." Keras turned on the male, closed the distance between them in the blink of an eye, and snarled in his face, flashing his emerging fangs. "Do you know who I am?" The male didn't even flinch. Enyo took hold of Keras's shoulder, and he eased back, reining in his fury as he leveled a black look on her. "Do you know who I am?" she spoke to the male. He practically reared back a step. His right fist flew to his chest, knocking against the spot over his heart. "Goddess of war." He bowed his head. The other three guards followed suit. Keras glared at them all. Enyo turned to smile on him. "Do not be angry with them. They are young. Most likely they have never seen your face since you have been in the mortal world the past 2 centuries. Her smile turned a little mischievous. "They do not know they spoke rudely to the firstborn of Hades." The leader blanched, his eyes widening as he kept his head bent, his gaze fixed on the pale flagstones at Keras's feet. Keras coaxed his shadows, let them dance around his shoes, savored the way sweat rolled down the male's cheek from beneath his helmet to drip from his chin. Or it might have been tears. "Answer his question, or I will not be held accountable for what he does to you." Enyo stepped aside again. The guard swallowed and raised his head, looked Keras in the eye with only a slight flicker of nerves in his. Keras listened as the male listed all who had passed through the gate in the last 48 hours. Far more than he had expected. He wasn't sure he would find the information he was looking for here. He was about to tell Enyo that when something the male said snagged the whole of his focus. "Then there were the 2 females with their Valkyrie escort." Keras frowned at him. Valkyries? The enemy had employed one once, back when Lizabeta, the illusionist, had wanted to make Escher her pet. Escher, Diamond, and Cal had defeated her. Valkyries were notoriously hard to kill, were impervious to damage unless you knew what their protective charm was and broke it. The thought that the enemy had more like her was troubling, but he couldn't discount the possibility. Not when his gut said these were the ones he was looking for. What did they look like? Were the 2 females blonde and young? Keras was tempted to peer into the male's eyes and see the memory for himself, but Enyo gave him a look. A stern one that said if he dared to try to use his powers, she was going to stop him. She didn't need to coddle him. He was feeling stronger now, could probably probe the guards' minds without breaking a sweat, although it would probably overstep the mark. Zeus wouldn't be happy if he went poking around in his men's heads without permission. The leader shook his head, causing the sunlight to glint off his golden helmet and hit Keras in the eyes. Keras grimaced and squinted, glared at the male who didn't seem to notice that he had almost blinded him. Or perhaps he didn't care. The male seemed a little too focused on Enyo. His dark gaze kept sliding to her, and the more he looked at her, the stronger the compulsion to put the male in his place grew. Enyo was his. The darker side of his blood snarled that, had him stepping closer to her to make it clear to the male that she was spoken for and they were more than allies seeking a common enemy. The leader's eyes leaped to his. They were brunettes and older, appearing around the venerable goddess of war's age. Venerable goddess of war? Keras slid Enyo a questioning look. She shrugged. All gods are trained to revere the gods and goddesses here. He is only being polite. Polite his arse. The male was trying to hit on her. The urge to hit the male instead grew stronger still. One of the other males stepped forwards, sparing his leader by dragging Keras's focus to him. The females had been blonde, I am certain of it. Or perhaps they had been brunettes. Which is it? Keras snapped, and his shadows rushed forwards towards the leader. Keras noticed and halted them before they could strike the male down, pulled them back under his control before anyone witnessed their unruly behavior. Of course, Enyo noticed it. She arched an eyebrow at him, her pointed look making it clear she had seen his shadows attempting to attack the one who insisted on hitting on her. The male dared to speak to her and her alone again. I am sure they were brunettes, my lady. My lady? Keras growled, unable to hold those words back as darkness raged through him. Roared at him to release the shadows he had held back so they could teach the male a lesson. He dropped dark, fearful eyes to the ground, to the shadows that whipped around Keras's feet, and stammered, I meant it only as a sign of respect. Keras huffed when Enyo delicately placed her hand on his arm and his shadows instantly settled, her touch like black magic that worked to calm him even as he tried to stoke his rage, desire to put the male in his place, demanding he obey it and obliterate him. Were they blondes or brunettes? She said, and for a heartbeat looked as if she might dare to smile at the males to encourage them to speak. Keras shot her another look. She slid him one in return. I'm seeing a new side to you today. He was too, and he wasn't sure whether she liked it or not. Her jade eyes warmed as she held his. Maybe she did like him showing the world that he could be a jealous, possessive bastard just like his father, but he doubted she would like it if the tethers of his control snapped, and he let that side of him rip through the males. They were blonde. The second male sounded more confident now. His certainty faltered as he looked at the other three guards. Weren't they? And something dawned on Keras. Meadow had used Lisabetta's blood to cast an illusion, but it had been weak enough that it hadn't worked properly on all the guards. We need to speak with Zeus. He grabbed Enyo's hand and turned with her towards the road that led up to the temples clustered on the steep side of Mount Olympus. His gaze fixed on the largest of the white-columned temples, one that occupied the top of the mountain and looked down on all the others and the city. Only he didn't need to go there. Zeus appeared before him. It had been a long time since he had seen his uncle, but he still wore the same crisp white thigh-length robe beneath his fine golden armor, and white leather boots that bore matching gold plates that covered the length of his shins. The delicate band of twisted gold that circled his head matched his eyes, glittered just like them as Zeus looked at him, a faint smile curling his lips and causing lines to bracket them and his eyes. Keras, it has been too long. His deep voice rolled over him, as warm as Keras remembered, heavy with a note of authority that had the four guards behind him and everyone else in the vicinity dropping to one knee, including Enyo. Zeus turned warm golden eyes on her and leaned to one side, causing the soft waves of his thick brown hair to fall down over his crown as he peered past Keras. Rise, Enyo. You do not need to bow to me. His uncle was in a suspiciously good mood. Normally, Zeus demanded all bowed to him. Keras took a closer look at him, noticed the worry lines on his worn face and that shimmer of uncertainty in his eyes as they shifted back to meet his. I tried speaking with Hades, but your father is being his usual stubborn self. Zeus straightened as Enyo came to stand behind Keras. Now Zeus's mood made a little more sense. He hadn't wanted to deliver bad news to Keras and thought Keras had come here to speak with him about his father. Maybe even pick Zeus up on the fact he hadn't been able to convince his brother to do his bidding. It is not why I came here. Keras stepped forwards and held his right arm out. Zeus gripped it near his elbow, and he did the same. But thank you for speaking with him. Zeus nodded, a curious edge to his eyes as he looked from Keras to Enyo and then his guards and the gate. Why did you come if not to speak with me about your father? Keras relayed what the guards had told him and his theory about how the Fury had used the blood of Lisabetta, a demon with the ability to cast powerful illusions, to cloak her and Mirinda, and most likely a witch and Meadow's demon bodyguards. Keras doubted that the enemy had managed to find more Valkyries to serve them. It was more likely that Meadow had brought her demon entourage with her. Zeus's face darkened throughout Keras's report, a troubled edge entering his golden eyes as he frowned. That troubled look soon became one of anger. Keras knew why. It was easy for Meadow to get from here to the underworld through the gate that linked Olympus to his father's realm. Zeus had allowed the enemy to slip unnoticed into Hades' realm, and his father was going to be furious. He needed to warn his father, although he doubted that Meadow would be foolish enough to mount a direct attack on Hades with only a few demons and possibly a witch as her allies. Even with the spells protecting the demon brutes, the Fury wouldn't win. There had to be another reason she had risked everything to get to the underworld in this way. Something is troubling you. Enyo's soft voice invaded his thoughts, and he blinked and looked at her. What is it? Keras dropped his gaze to his feet, his eyebrows meeting hard. Meadow the Fury risked a lot to use this method of entering the underworld. A direct attack on my father with such a small force will only end in failure. It would have been better for her side if she had opened the Tokyo gate and forced it to remain open. It would have weakened my father. Perhaps they seek to meet with Nemesis and her forces? Enyo's gaze drilled into him, but he couldn't bring himself to look at her, couldn't tear his eyes away from the pale flagstones as he mulled that over. That's logical, and makes the most sense. He pressed his hand to his stomach. But it doesn't feel right. If the reports Enyo filed are correct, Nemesis does have a strong force behind her. Teaming up with them is the only logical reason the Fury would endanger herself by using these gates. Zeus's deep voice rolled over him, a confident note in it that backed up what Enyo had said and made Keras want to believe they were right. But his gut said they were wrong. Why would Meadow enter the underworld this way if not to meet with Nemesis and attack his father, though? He frowned harder as he reached for a reason, as he pieced everything together and looked at it from all angles. It didn't make sense, because it went against what the Moirai had foreseen. The future was changeable, but an event of this magnitude wasn't something the three fates were likely to get wrong, and if he and his brothers had altered the course of the future to a new one, then the Moirai would have foreseen that and warned his father by now. Meadow must have come directly to the gate to Olympus in Greece as soon as she had managed to capture Mirinda. Mirinda had to be the reason Meadow had made this move. Together they were stronger, formed a cycle of power that increased whatever abilities they had at their disposal as they passed them between each other. Mirinda didn't have to be compliant in order for Meadow to use that cycle of power to her advantage, or take whatever powers Mirinda might have gained by being in contact with Keras and his brothers, including the power to open a gate. The only logical move that made sense to Keras would have been Meadow taking Mirinda to Tokyo to breach the only gate between the mortal realm and the underworld, just as the Moirai had foreseen. His eyes widened. What is it? Enyo moved a step closer. If the future had changed, then the Moirai would have seen it. He looked at his uncle, and Zeus nodded. They would have told you or my father immediately, so the future has remained unchanged. The enemy will breach a gate between the mortal world and the underworld. Enyo looked from Zeus to him. But the Erinyes have the power to open the gate, and they are both in the underworld. Do you think there is another enemy in the mortal world who could open a gate for them? Do you think Meadow plans to convince Callistos to open a gate for her?" Keras shook his head. They were both solid theories, but they were both wrong. He looked her in the eye. "I think the future the Moir I saw is different to how we've interpreted it. We thought the enemy would breach the gates from the mortal side, but there are two sides to a gate. What if the enemy isn't going to open and damage the remaining gate from the mortal side, but from the underworld side?" Enyo's jade eyes slowly widened. "It makes sense. You and your brothers have closed all but one gate in the mortal world, and the enemy must know you will protect that fiercely. They know there is little hope of them being able to breach it from the mortal side where you all are. They know you are exiled to that realm, too, so unlikely to interfere with them if they are in the underworld." He nodded, a sense of urgency building inside him, laced with excitement and anticipation that roused his darker side, filling him with a need to get moving. "The Tokyo Gate is still active, meaning somewhere in the underworld there's a gate still linked to it. What if Nemesis never planned to go through the gate? What if she pulled together a large force of allies not because she intended to fight, but because she needed them to find the gate? The gate moves constantly and only my father knows where it will appear next, but when the gate is in a location, it is always visible." "If Nemesis has a large enough number of allies helping her, she will find the gate quickly. She might already know where it is." Enyo glanced at Zeus before settling her gaze back on Keras. "The beast that protects the gate." "It would be no match for a large force, especially if they had the Fury and a witch, and those demons we fought in the mortal realm." Keras worried his lower lip with his thumb, his mind speeding through every scenario. "I have to tell my father. The enemy have a head start on us and might have already found the gate. I would feel it opening, so if they have found it, they must be fighting to reach it. Father might be able to move the gate while they're occupied or before they find it. It would buy us some time. Enyo, you have my leave to fight on Keras's side as a representative of Olympus. Relay to your brother that he will be expected to participate in the coming war." A golden bolt of lightning crackled in Zeus's clenched fist as his eyes brightened and his features hardened. "I will give my brother no choice in this matter." Those were fighting words if ever Keras had heard them. His father didn't like being ordered around by his brothers, especially Zeus. Normally, Keras would have spoken out against such a plan, would have stood on his father's side and done something to make it clear he wouldn't allow anyone to interfere in this matter and go against Hades' wishes. But Zeus was right about Hades. He was being stubborn. His father needed allies in this war, and Keras would welcome anyone who chose to fight on his side. Protecting his family was more important to him than defending his father's right to rule as he saw fit in his own realm. His father might be angry with him for siding against him for once, but his mother would back him up. That would be Hades' downfall. He never had been able to withstand the force that was Persephone. Keras glanced at Enyo, recalling how his shadows had calmed when she had touched him, settling against his will. It seemed he had inherited more of his father's traits than he had thought. "I will speak with my father about this." Keras reached for her hand and stroked his fingers across her palm, gaining her attention and a look from Zeus. One that warmed his golden eyes and told Keras his uncle was glad that he and Enyo had finally stopped dancing around their feelings. "I will speak with my brother." She shifted her hand in his, curled her fingers around to grip him briefly before she released him. Her jade eyes softened, made him feel she didn't want to part from him, and gods, that made him want to wrap his arms around her and pull her close and never let her go. There was fear in the depths of her eyes, nerves he felt in their bond, feelings that flooded him with a need to stay by her side because she was afraid of talking to her brother, and he knew he was the reason for that fear. She hadn't spoken with her brother since returning to the mortal realm to help Keras. Her brother Ares could be a callous and cold bastard. There was a chance he would attempt to punish her for leaving his side, for not being at his beck and call if she went to see him alone. She smiled tightly. "I will join you in the underworld as soon as I am done." Keras stepped up to her, lifted his left hand and slid it along her jaw. He tilted her head up and stared down into her eyes, aware all the fires of the underworld raged in his, as he thought about her brother trying to keep her from him, trying to part them once again. "I give you an hour. If you are not back with me, I will return with a legion of my father's forces to take you back." He lowered his head and kissed her before she could respond, before she could call him on the fact he was being overbearing now. When he released her, she didn't berate him. She just smiled, a soft, warm one that stole his heart. He stepped back and forced himself to teleport to the gate to the underworld on the other side of the city, the only way he could enter his father's realm without being summoned. He walked onto the raised circular gate as soon as he appeared, crossing the horizontal shimmering rings to the central violet disk. It flashed brightly, and he closed his eyes as he was pulled through it, only opening them again once he was on the other side. He had never liked the way he seemed to spin wildly in all directions when traveling through a gate. The first time he had passed through one, he had almost vomited. Since then, he had closed his eyes every time. He teleported again once he hit solid ground, stepping directly to the main drawing room of his parents' palatial home. "Keras!" Megan's bright voice seemed so out of place in the palace, too filled with light and warmth to be a part of the home he had grown up in. "Megan." He dipped his head as she walked to him, her hand skimming over her baby bump, shifting the loose amethyst top she wore. Even the colors she chose to wear were out of place in this realm. "Is Aries okay?" Her chocolate eyes leaped between his, a flicker of fear in them. He touched her shoulder. "Aries is fine. You will see him again sooner than we had anticipated. The enemy has entered the underworld." A chilling darkness washed through the room as Hades pushed to his feet, dropping the book he had been reading onto the seat of the gilt-framed crimson armchair in front of the fireplace. He turned to his father, moving slightly in front of Megan as she stiffened, and the fear he could feel in her rose. "The Fury captured Mirinda and has brought her through the gate in Olympus. I believe—" "What?" Hades boomed, his blue eyes blazing scarlet as they narrowed on Keras, as the light in the room dimmed further. Persephone hurried to him and touched his arm. "Calm yourself, my love. Think of the baby." War erupted in his father's eyes, a battle between the urge to lash out and the desperate need to do as Persephone had asked for Megan's sake. Megan pressed closer to Keras's back, and the urge to protect her rose fiercely within him, had him staring his father down and watching him closely, so he was ready to make a move if his father did. "What is done, Keras said, somehow managing to keep his voice calm, even as irritation flowed through him too. Anger that the enemy had slipped past him and entered this realm. "I believe the calamity the Moirai foresaw was not triggered by the enemy breaching a gate in the mortal world, but by them breaching a gate in this one." He locked gazes with his father. "I request permission for the exile to be lifted. I request permission to come home." Hades stared down at him, his red eyes filled with rage and battle hunger that echoed inside Keras. "Granted." Chapter 23. "He said what?" Ares boomed, and Enyo stood her ground as her brother turned on her. He took swift strides towards her across the mosaic floor in the main room of his house, his blue eyes darkening by degrees as he closed the distance between them. The sunlight streaming in through the bank of windows to her right, where her favorite blue chaise longue stood, reflected off his golden armor and warmed his tanned skin, and bounced off the white walls. "Zeus has ordered you to participate in the coming war in the underworld." She braced herself as Ares halted close to her, loomed over her with a spark of anger lighting his irises. Rage she could feel in him when he was this close to her. His power, his strength wrapped around her, pressed down on her. She curled her fingers into fists and clenched them, steeled herself, and refused to crumble under the pressure. "And I suppose you convinced him of this?" Ares barked and leaned closer, his golden eyebrows meeting hard as he sneered at her. "Honestly, Enyo, I thought you foolish for chasing the firstborn of Hades before, but this is just pathetic. Have you spread your thighs for him? Surely that honeyed trap would be enough to secure his backing and have him—" Enyo slapped him. The urge came out of nowhere, struck her so hard and fast that she didn't have a chance to consider the consequences of her actions, or stop them from taking place. Her palms stung as she stood there with her hands still in the air, as her brother closed his eyes and clenched his jaw, and tilted his head even further away from her. His blue eyes flicked open, locked on her. His voice was low as he stared at her. "I see how it is now. He has poisoned you against me. He was always trying to do such a thing, and now he has succeeded. Tell me, did he fill your head with pretty promises? Sweet lies that tempted you to open your legs to him?" Ares rounded on her, darkness washing across his handsome features as he touched the red stain on his cheek. "Whatever he told you, it was all lies to get between your thighs." It wasn't. She told herself that as she stared her brother down, fighting the doubts that began to multiply in her mind. Her brother was just jealous. His possessive side was rearing its ugly head, the side that desperately clung to his position, and would do anything to stop her from attaining one that was above him. He was trying to sabotage what she had with Keras so she would remain with him, under his thumb, his to order around and keep from the spotlight. She saw another meaning in his words, too. He was painting Keras with the same brush that had created him, trying to push his own personality on Keras. But Keras was nothing like him. Her brother was the liar. He used his position to manipulate females into doing his bidding, probably whispered whatever they needed to hear in their ear to convince them to sleep with him, and then discarded them when he grew bored with them. She had watched him for centuries, knew him better than anyone. Her brother was the despicable one, not Keras. Keras loved her, she felt sure of that, believed the words he had told her with an earnest look in his green eyes, and the feeling she had felt in him. He loved her. Ares must have seen the momentary flicker of doubt in her heart, because his lips twisted in a cruel smile that brightened his blue eyes. He casually turned away from her, stroked a hand over his golden hair, and stooped to pick up his heavy blue cloak from one of the chairs. He fastened it to one side of his gold chest piece and then the other, took his time about inspecting the richly colored material before lifting his head. His eyes locked on her again. "Keras was in the mortal world for 2 centuries. Ares picked a piece of lint from his cloak and flicked it onto the mosaic floor. "I wonder how many females he convinced to sleep with him in that time." His blue gaze slowly narrowed on her as a smile curled the corners of his mouth. She refused to be rattled by him, refused to believe the hurtful words he was lining up on his lips. "A man has needs, Enyo. The pleasure of one's own hand is nothing compared with the pleasure of sinking yourself into a hot, slick, welcoming body." She glared at him. "He has probably bedded hundreds of females, thousands, perhaps even several at a time." He pulled a face of mock pity as she glared at him, the shield she had brought up around her heart taking a hit, as her mind filled with images of Keras with other women. "Poor, sweet, foolish Enyo. Did he tell you that you were special? Did he say he only has eyes for you? That he hasn't slept with anyone since you two met?" Ares paced the room, wisely keeping his distance from her, his gaze fixed on her wherever he went. "He is not a liar like you." She couldn't hold back those words as rage began to get the better of her, the hurt mounting rapidly inside her, now drawing it to the surface. "He isn't." She believed that. "Strange that he never came to see you." Ares pivoted to face her, and she steeled herself again, because the glimmer in his eyes said he had thought of something that would break her and found pleasure in it. 2 centuries banished from the underworld, but not this one. What stopped him from coming to see you?" "He was not welcome here." She knew that in her heart, clung to it like a raft in a stormy ocean. "The sons of Hades have never been welcome here. Not only that, but he had a duty to perform in the mortal world." "Duty?" Pfft. Ares waved her away. "How noble that excuse sounds." "It is not an excuse." He grinned again. "He did not come here. Did you go to see him?" She glared at him again, because he knew damned well that she hadn't been to see Keras. He pulled that mock pity face again, and the urge to slap him returned. "Did you not go to visit him because you feared you would discover he had a lover?" "No," she bit out, but her heart called her a liar. She had feared that. Keras was handsome, drew the gazes of females wherever he went, and gained their attention without even trying. She had told him she was getting married before he had left her. There had been no reason for him to remain loyal to her, even if he had viewed her as more than just a friend and had loved her as she had hoped. In fact, she had felt that if he had loved her, he would have had even more reason to find himself another female. Her announcement would have hurt him, and he would have wanted to rid himself of his feelings for her. So God's yes, she had feared he had found someone else to love, or had indulged in a string of lovers, moving from one to the next as her brother did. Her strength failed her heart taking a direct hit as her brother's words all rolled up on her, collided in her head to tear her down. The urge to strike her brother transformed into an urge to get away from him, to find some space and be alone. She needed to be alone. "Zeus ordered you to participate. Do so or do not. I do not care." She turned on her heel and stormed from the room, flinched when Ares called after her and drove a dagger into her back, right into her heart. "When you realize he is a liar and has used you, do not come crawling back to me." Ennio strode into the courtyard that overlooked the city, breathed deep of the fresh air and closed her eyes, desperately trying to push out the hurt and let the warmth that had filled her for the past few days flood her again. Only it refused to come, because she needed to see Keras again. She teleported to the gate and stepped onto it, and as soon as she reached the underworld, she teleported again, landing at the gates of the palace. The guards stepped aside for her, and she hurried forwards, avoiding the main temple that loomed before her and heading to her right instead, towards a building that stood in the distance there. The black Palladian three-story mansion looked small in the shadows of the mountain that towered behind it, but it housed close to 40 rooms, including 10 bedrooms with ensuite bathrooms, and a master bedroom that was enormous. The central third of it had great towering columns that supported a triangular pediment and made the house resemble the main palace. The lowest windows of the house were small, set into a wall of chiseled blocks that was deeper than the smooth stone that filled the facade above it. Light shone from those windows, and she imagined how busy the staff were now that the master of the house had returned. Hades had built it for Keras only a century before he had banished his son to the mortal world, and she could clearly recall how Keras had hated it at first. He had missed his family, even though they were only a short distance away in the main palace, and had complained about rattling around in such a large home all alone. She could understand why he had found it unsettling. The house had been built for large parties, for having guests staying for periods of time, company to share the grandeur of the place with, and impress them with the opulence of it all. The problem was, Keras had never been one for lavish affairs. He had never been one to make friends. She paused on the path to it that cut through a meadow of tulips in full bloom. In fact, she couldn't remember him having any friends, other than her. Her heart skipped a beat and she lifted her head, her gaze instantly fixing on Keras as he moved to the elegant balustrade that lined the edge of a raised paved area at the front of the house, separating it from the gardens where Ennio stood. Gods! That same heart started at a pace as she drifted towards him, heat flooding her as she drank her fill of Keras as he paced, his left hand resting on the hilt of the sword that hung from his waist. She had forgotten how handsome he looked in his armor. The black pieces resembled the ones his father wore, the boots rising to above his knee to end in a pointed cap that shifted away from his thigh with each step. The crimson edging them made them stand out as he pivoted, the swiftness of the movement causing his scarlet cloak to flare outwards. That same shade of red covered the pointed fingers of his gauntlets, making them look as if he had already bathed his talons in blood. The black and red armor that protected his chest clung close to it, shaped like muscles that made her itch to peel it off him and see the real ones he hid beneath it. He paused as he noticed her, smiled. That smile faded as the black slashes of his eyebrows met and he disappeared, reappearing right in front of her in a swirl of shadows. "What did your brother say to you?" He lifted his hand, darkness warring with concern in his green eyes, as he carefully stroked her cheek with the backs of his talons. Was it that obvious? Ennio turned her cheek to him, not wanting to answer that question because she didn't want to look weak. She didn't want to look as if she doubted him. She didn't want her brother to be right. Keras sighed. It was about me, wasn't it? She nodded, the barest dip of her chin, and the feelings colliding inside her whirled faster, building speed that filled her with a desperate need to say something, to get everything out into the open and off her chest so the crushing weight of doubt would be lifted from her heart. Whether that was because Keras admitted it was true or confirmed it was a lie didn't matter. She just needed to know. She looked at him deep into his emerald eyes, seeking the truth there. After we parted, when you were in the mortal world, did you— Her courage failed her as darkness washed across his features, and crimson invaded his irises. I will kill him. He dropped his hand to the hilt of his sword and gripped it. She lunged for his arm to stop him from drawing the weapon, heart fluttering wildly in her throat as two thoughts clashed in her mind. Did he want to kill her brother because he had revealed the truth to her, or because he had tried to turn her against him by lying to her? Keras's hard expression softened, and he loosened his grip on his blade and cupped her cheek, his gauntlet cool against her face. It has always been you, Enyo. From the moment we met, I've been loyal to you. She hadn't realized how badly she had needed to hear those words, not until they wrapped around her like a comforting blanket, keeping the chilling cold of her brother's lies at bay. She sank into Keras's touch, her strength wavering, hurt welling up in her heart, but for a different reason now. Keras's eyes darkened slightly again. He's a bastard. He's my brother, she whispered, part of her still feeling as if she should defend him, even after he had hurt her, had intentionally tried to ruin things between her and Keras by sowing discord. He's still a bastard. Keras gently gathered her into his arms, gripped the back of her head, and held her. The only reason I haven't stepped to Olympus to kill him is because it would kill you too. I cannot hurt you like that. She smiled faintly, silently thanking Keras for knowing her so well, and for caring about her so deeply. Ares was her only family. She might hate him sometimes, and he could be callous and cruel, but he was her brother. She wanted to resist as Keras drew back and gazed down at her, ached to be pressed close to him again, but something in his eyes stopped her. What? Keras cut himself off. His emerald eyes darted between hers, laced with uncertainty, and she sensed the nerves rising inside him. He stared into her eyes for a moment, and then drew down a breath and forced words out. What about you? Was there ever— She was quick to shake her head, to end his pain and suffering, to take it all away for him. Never. Not since we met. It was always you for me, too. The barest hint of a smile curled the corners of his lips. I want you to live here with me. She warmed right down to her bones as she stared into Keras's eyes and saw in them that he truly wanted that. Because you do not like rattling around in this big empty house? She smiled softly over his shoulder at it. He huffed. It is not so empty right now. You would find it amusing to know I am out here because it is too noisy in there right now. I wanted some peace. Her smile became a teasing grin. You finally have guests and you want them gone. That is not playing the good host. He shrugged that off and dropped his arms, wrapping them around her waist as he gazed down at her. I always preferred it when it was just you and me. I had hoped that by complaining about being lonely that you would keep me company more. Speaking of which, you didn't answer me. She frowned, unsure what he was talking about. He pulled her a little closer and she pressed her hands to his chest, tilted her head back and looked up into his eyes. They warmed and shone at her, bewitching her. I want you to live here with me. She wrinkled her nose. Are you asking me to move in with you? He hiked his shoulders again. In a roundabout fashion. She pretended to think it over, enjoying the way his face slowly darkened, his impatience showing on it as he waited. When she had been silent for longer than a minute, he huffed. Will you move in with me or not? She cast her gaze over the house. It is a rather nice house. Large, elegant, very grand. What woman wouldn't be happy to be mistress of it? He glowered at her. "Answer me." "I am," she said with a sly smile. "In a roundabout fashion." He huffed again. She skimmed her hands up to his throat and swept her fingers over it and along the line of his jaw. "Yes." That single word falling from her lips changed him entirely. His eyes lit up, a smile chasing the shadows from his face as he grasped her backside and lifted her, raising her mouth to his. He kissed her softly with so much love that she was sure she would melt. He stopped and drew back as raised voices came from behind him, grimaced when Valen shouted something obscene. Escher answered him, and it felt good to hear he was awake again. Keras's brother Ares hollered something back at him. "I always felt a little envious of your family," she murmured, amused by the argument about having to live in Keras's house, while Keras looked dismayed and close to the end of his tether. "It is so different from mine." The light that had been filling her flickered and died as she thought about her Ares, as she recalled the things he had said to her, and her heart ached all over again. She loved her brother, but Keras was right. He was a bastard. He always made her feel as if the love was one-sided, as if she was nothing but a pawn to him, something he could strategically use to advance his own rise in the ranks of Olympus. "As much as I hate him, he does love you. I saw it once." Keras stroked her sides. She shrugged this time. "Perhaps, but he buried it under layers of narcissism." A smile tugged at Keras's lips. "It is as strange to hear you speak out against your brother as it is to be home." "I am done with being what others expect of me. This is my life. I get to choose how I live it." Strength flowed through her as those words hit home, struck something deep inside her that made her feel right for the first time in a long time. She lifted her eyes to lock with Keras's. "Or who I live with." He dipped his head and kissed her again as he gathered her to him. Warm light filled her as she sank into his embrace and lost herself in his kiss, the feeling of rightness growing stronger inside her as she thought about her future, a future she would be sharing with Keras. Cool darkness swept around her, and when it receded, she was in a large room with rich blue walls and elegant antique furniture, and a huge four-poster bed. Keras backed her towards it. Chapter 24. The soft glide of Keras's lips down her throat had Enyo tilting her head back into the black silk sheets. A groan tumbled from her as he kissed the swell of her breast, as his fingers eased the strap that held her chest piece in place. He didn't stop kissing her skin as he worked to free the buckle, as he eased her breastplate open and cool air washed across her stomach. She closed her eyes and melted into the bed beneath him, surrendered to him completely, letting him do as he pleased and drifting in the warmth his touch ignited in her. A touch that seemed to take away all her tension and anger, had her mind emptying and all of her focus shifting towards this moment with him. His cloak brushed between her thighs as he moved, as he drifted lower to tease her breasts with his mouth. She trembled as he sucked her nipple through the material of her bandeau, sank deeper into the mattress and raised her arms, toying with her hair as he worshipped her body. Gods, it felt good. It felt right. She had dreamed of a moment like this for centuries, had imagined it countless times, both when she had been alone and when she had been with him, trying to guess at what it would feel like to have his mouth on her, his hands on her. The reality of it was far better than any fantasy or dream she'd had about Keras. The previous times they had been intimate had started off like this, a slow and gentle exploration of each other, but it always ended in a fast and frantic coupling. This time it felt different. She felt that all the way down to her soul. Keras pushed the bandeau up and eased it over her head, discarded it and dropped his lips to her breasts again. She moaned and arched to meet him as his lips swept across her nipple, sending 1,000 sparks skittering over her flesh. He groaned with her and skimmed his hand down her stomach, heading for the juncture of her thighs. The cool kiss of metal against her skin made her still. "Wait." She lowered her hand and pressed it to his shoulder, to the hard plate of his armor. As much as she had fantasized about him wearing this armor, she wanted to feel his flesh against hers, ached for him to be skin on skin with her this time. Maybe later they could indulge the fantasy building in her mind, one that had her shivering as she thought about him skimming the talons of his gauntlets over her breasts. He pulled back and frowned down at her and then his hand. That frown deepened and he eased back onto his knees, hastily removed his gauntlets and tossed them onto the floor. He followed them with his cloak, and an urge blasted through her, had her rising onto her knees before him and taking the heavy material from him. She set it down on the edge of the bed and looked him over, deciding where to start. Maybe she could indulge a little fantasy after all. She began at his left shoulder, carefully uncoupling the pauldron, growing aware of Keras's gaze as it followed her every move. She took her time about removing his armor, each piece she set aside cranking the heat inside her up another degree. When his chest was bare, she feathered her fingers over it, tracing the peaks and valleys of his muscles, turning that heat up further. She bit her lip as she followed the line between his pectorals, easing her fingers downwards towards his stomach. He tensed when she reached it, his muscles flexing in a beautiful symphony of strength that had her belly quivering, flooded her with an urge to push him onto his back and mount him. Rather than giving in to that need, she stroked her fingers lower and circled his navel. "Enyo," he husked, his voice thick with desire. She glanced up at him as she followed the trail of crisp black hair that led downwards, a shiver racking her as his hungry emerald gaze locked with hers. How many centuries had she ached for him to look at her like this? How many years had she silently begged him to show her that he felt something for her that matched how she felt about him? The way he looked at her, somewhere between a man starved and a man deeply in love, etched itself on her memory, set fire to her body. She teased the waist of his trousers. He obediently shifted to the edge of the bed and stood for her, and she didn't keep him waiting, couldn't stop herself from following him and tackling the first plate of armor that protected his hips. His rough breaths filled her ears as she freed him of the rest of his armor, quickened as she finally reached for the button of his tight black trousers, the only thing that stood between her and finally having him naked. His entire body tensed again as she made contact, her fingers brushing his skin above the waist of his trousers. She moaned as she drank her fill of him, was sure she would never tire of looking at him or knowing that he was hers now. Hers forever. He could be possessive and so could she. She didn't want other females looking at him, wanted to claw their eyes out so they couldn't feast on his beauty, imagining him with them. He belonged to her. She pushed his trousers down and bit her lower lip. Every inch of him. His long cock bobbed as she stared at it, as heat flooded between her thighs and made her want to rub them together. "Enyo," he murmured, more of a groan this time, one that made her feel she was torturing him by staring at him and doing nothing. Maybe she was. It felt like torture to her, too. She eased her hands up his thighs, through the light dusting of hair that covered them, and curled them around just below his backside, luring him towards her. He came willingly, the feel of his gaze on her intensifying as she kept hers rooted on his erection. She had never done this act, had only slept with one man other than Keras, centuries before she had met him when her brother had cajoled her into it. She hadn't enjoyed it, had thought her brother had blown the pleasure of being intimate with another way out of proportion. But making love with Keras had made her realize that her brother was right about some things. The pleasure of being with Keras was mind-blowing and addictive, and she wanted to feel it again. Wanted to give him all the pleasure he could handle. Starting with this. She stroked her tongue up the length of him, from root to blunt tip, and he groaned as his head fell back. His hands fisted at his sides as she licked him again, tasting his flesh. He was warm like silk beneath her hand as she brought it into play, as she explored him, but he was like steel, too, so hard it seemed impossible. Was it because he was enjoying this? Enyo wrapped her lips around the crown, and Keras's hips bucked forwards as a breathless moan left him, answering her question. He was enjoying this, and she had only just started. What kind of reactions could she expect from him? When he had delved between her thighs, she had lost her mind and control of her body. She had never felt so wanton and wild, lost in feeling and consumed by a desperate need for more. Could she make Keras feel that? Determination to find out filled her. She feathered her fingers along the veined length of him as she explored the crown with her tongue, found several spots that had him shuddering and easing his hips forwards. When she curled her hand around him and sucked him, he grunted and his hand came down on her head. His fingers twined in her hair, gripping her gently as she sucked him again, as she swirled her tongue around him and stroked him with her hand. Enyo. Her name had never sounded so wicked. He whispered it breathlessly. A plea and a demand rolled into one. He liked this. She smiled against his cock and began moving her mouth on him as well as her hand. His fingers tightened in her hair and his hips began to move, shifting forward slightly each time she took him into her mouth, as if he ached to go deeper. She dropped her hand lower and took him deeper, savored his groan as she moved her mouth on him, as the blunt tip brushed the back of her mouth on each downward glide. He clutched her head and thrust into her, his breaths coming faster still, his buttocks tensing beneath her hand as she palmed his backside. A grunt left him, followed by another, the masculine sound teasing her ears and causing another flood of heat between her thighs. She ached for him there, her mind racing forwards to imagine him inside her, filling and stretching her. He gripped her hair and pulled out of her, and she frowned up at him, wanting him back in her mouth again. His dark emerald eyes seared her, his dilated pupils devouring his irises as he gazed down at her. Gods, he looked delicious like that, towering over her, his hand in her hair and every muscle on his body tensed. His gaze lowered to her breasts, darkened further, filled her with a sense that this time wasn't going to be slow either, mostly because she didn't want slow anymore. She ached for him, couldn't stop her fingers from gliding up and down his rigid length to tease him, or her mind from imagining him sliding it inside her. She burned with need. His gaze lifted and collided with hers, and she was sure he must have read her mind. She moaned as he took hold of her shoulders and twisted her away from him on the bed, as he pushed her forwards and she fell to her hands and knees on the mattress. A fantasy she'd had sprung to the front of her mind, had her pulse rushing as she recalled how one of her daydreams about her removing Keras's armor had ended like this. He skimmed his hands up her bare thighs, pushed them under the small skirt she wore beneath the slats of her armor. Those slats were cold as they hit her back, but she didn't notice as he palmed her bottom, as he cupped and squeezed it. Her breath sawed from her lips, anticipation rolling through her as he slipped his fingers into the waist of her underwear and tugged it down to her knees. Cold air kissed her bare skin, and she shook as he gripped her buttocks, as he pressed his thumbs in and spread her, exposing her to his searing gaze. She shivered as he stroked his thumbs downwards, teasing her plush petals, easing them between her folds. A moan fell from her lips as he caressed the pad of his thumb over her most sensitive flesh. She couldn't stop herself from lifting her hips, from spreading her knees a little to tempt him. He groaned and removed one hand from her, kept teasing her nub with the other, quickening her blood as ripples of pleasure flowed through her. She trembled as the blunt crown of his length brushed her, as it pierced her, and she fought the temptation to ease back onto him. He stood behind her, his cock poised to enter her, remained still so long she wanted to curse him. His hands caressed her thighs, folded around the front of them, and drew her back. Her breath left her on a stuttering sigh as he filled her, slowly at first, and became a moan as he drove deep into her, as deep as she could take him. Keras gripped her thighs, his thumbs digging into her buttocks as he withdrew and filled her again, as he set a maddening pace that had her breasts swinging with each thrust. She fisted the silk bedclothes as he drove into her, his body striking her hard with each meeting of their hips, sending waves of tingles shooting outwards from her sensitive flesh whenever he brushed it. He dropped his right hand to the front of her hip as he leaned over her, as he pulled her up to him with his left hand. He seized her jaw and turned her head towards him, and a cry burst from her lips as he covered her mouth, and his fingers found her nub, stroked and teased it as he took her. The same wild, desperate feeling she had experienced in her first time with him flooded her, stole control and pushed her over the edge. She pressed back against him, worked her hips and goaded him, tightening her body around his cock as he filled her. He growled and gripped her harder, gave her what she craved as he pounded into her, his rough breaths like music to her ears as they joined hers. His fingers squeezed her bead. Her entire body seized, a cry lodging in her throat, and a blinding wave of heat surged through her. Stars winked across her eyes as every inch of her trembled, as her core quivered and Keras kept thrusting and teasing her. Her mind emptied, ears ringing, and she sank forwards, her cheek hitting the silk sheets, her body completely at his mercy as bliss swept through her. The tight ache began to build again as he stroked her flesh, had her coming through the haze of one release and craving another, the satisfaction she had experienced dissipating as her body and mind realized she could have another release if he kept going. "More," she uttered, and it came out as a demand. Keras grunted and gripped her harder, thrust deeper and faster, his hips pistoning as his breath swashed across her bare back. He squeezed and stroked her, growled as he took her, as she clenched him and reached for a second release. It came upon her in another blinding flash as Keras shoved deep into her and spilled himself, his seed pulsing into her in waves that pushed her over the edge with him. She sank deeper into the mattress as he held her hips, as he pressed his throbbing length into her and kept her on him. A sigh escaped her as she drifted, sleep trying to roll up on her as she slowly relaxed, as warmth curled through her and melted her muscles and liquefied her bones. Keras eased out of her and flopped onto his back beside her, his breath leaving him in a rush. He tugged her to him and kissed her, a soft and slow one that was filled with love. Enyo shuffled so her breast pressed against his bare chest and kissed him, savoring each one, aware that at any moment they might be called into action, might have to fight for their lives. Keras gathered her closer. Warmth turned to the first flicker of heat in her veins. She was sure they should be meeting with the others, that they should be planning everything and discussing strategies. But she couldn't bring herself to leave this bubble just yet, craved a little more time alone with Keras. He rolled her beneath him and pressed his hips to her thigh, his semi-erect cock telling her that he wasn't ready to face the others yet either. They would have a strategy meeting, after their next climax. Chapter 25. Enyo didn't miss the way Keras's fingers stroked the band she had woven for him, one that circled his wrist still, as he talked tactics with his family in the middle of his library. His brothers had all removed their limiters, something they were able to do now they were back in the underworld where their powers wouldn't negatively affect anything. But Keras had chosen to keep his on, and she understood why. He was afraid of what would happen if he felt the full strength of his power. He feared it would be too much for him to handle. She inched closer to him as he studied a map of the realms of the underworld that had been spread across the large table in the center of the room, a need to reassure him filling her. He was stronger now, his dependence on the pills slowly waning. Over the last few days, she hadn't seen him struggling once, not as he had before. Back in the mortal world, he had still experienced bad episodes that had left him shaking and weak. Since entering the underworld again, he had been growing stronger, even looked more like his old self. When she lifted her hand and touched the bracelet, he paused halfway through saying something and looked at her. Smiled. There was gratitude in that smile, together with love. He slipped his hand into hers and held it. "That's still weird," Valen muttered as his golden eyes fixed on their joined hands. He slid a look at his brother Ares. "You don't think that's weird?" "What?" Ares blinked himself back to the room, his hands pausing on Megan's stomach where she stood in front of him with her back to his chest. Ares had been stroking it for the last 10 minutes, falling into a sort of trance as he had stared at her baby bump. Valen huffed. "No one listens to me anymore." Diamond boxed him on his arm. "Come on, Grumpy Pants. We were listening. You just weren't saying anything interesting." Valen glared at Diamond as amusement filled his pale blue eyes. Keras sighed. As usual, it was enough to stop his brothers from bickering. She had studied that power of his over the last few days they had all been together in his home, trying to learn whether it worked every time or whether there were specific circumstances in which a sigh from him would have his brothers falling back in line. So far, she was leaning towards the power of his sigh being infallible. Callistos paced back into view, stepping out from behind Merrick, Katerina, Ava, and Cassandra, where they formed a group between Diamond and Ares. Keras's youngest brother hadn't stopped moving since coming around yesterday. was eager to get out there and had made several suggestions for Keras's plan, mostly focused on drawing the enemy out. "Relax, kid." Valen reached for him. A mistake. Cal turned on him and he went flying, shot past Ennio as she swayed right towards Keras to avoid being struck by him, and grunted as he hit the pale green wall of the library. Ava hit Cal with a barrage of insults in Italian and hurried to Valen, who tried to brush her off and then reluctantly accepted her help when she started swearing at him instead. Ava pulled him back onto his feet and checked him over. "Callistos," Keras said. It was enough to have Cal backing down, the storm that had been building in his eyes abating. He ran a shaky hand over his blonde ponytail. "I need her back. I need to do something. I'm losing my fucking mind. I need her back, Keras." Keras released her hand and went to his brother, gripped his shoulder, and nodded as he looked down into Cal's eyes. "I know. We know. Father will tell us as soon as he knows where the gate is moved to, and we can go there. We will get her back." Cal nodded and then looked at Cassandra. "You sure you can't feel her?" Cassandra's blue eyes shone with concern, and Ennio had the feeling it wasn't only for her ward Mirinda. The sorceress was worried about Callistos, too. Clearly felt bad that she couldn't do anything to ease his pain and help him find his love. "I tried," Cass said, her voice whisper soft. It wasn't enough for Cal. He took a hard step towards her. "Try again." And then another. Wind whipped around him as his face darkened, and Merrick and Escher lunged for the map as it fluttered, placing their hands on it to stop it from flying away. "Try again! Try harder!" Cal barked, and Cass raised her hands in front of herself. The blast of wind that Cal had aimed at her deflected off a barrier that shimmered before her, splitting into two. It struck the wall to his left near the fireplace, causing books to explode from the shelves, and the other half came at Ennio. Keras stepped in front of her and took the hit, gave a muffled grunt as the blast knocked him back into Ennio despite him bracing himself. He growled at Cal. "Watch your temper." His youngest brother instantly backed off, the darkness lifting from his face as his wide eyes shot to Keras. He looked as if he wanted to apologize, and then his face crumpled, and he pivoted on his heel and started pacing again. "You all right, baby?" Diamond came up behind Cass and then rounded her, looked her over with concern in his pale eyes as his white eyebrows furrowed. She nodded. Her face fell. "I tried my hardest." "I know." He stroked her arm. "Cal is just frustrated. He knows you did your best." "I need her back, too." Cass issued everyone a black look. One Ennio supposed was meant to make them all look away, because she didn't want to look weak in front of them. None of them did. She glared at everyone but stepped up to Diamond anyway, let him wrap his arms around her and hold her as she rested her head on his shoulder, her long fall of black hair and her black corset and leathers, making her blend with him as she angled her head away from him. Diamond caressed the line of her spine, tiny frost flowers blooming on his black leather gloves as he held her, and glared at Cal as he came into view, pacing towards the other end of the room. "Are you all right?" Ennio whispered, and Keras looked over his shoulder at her and nodded. He moved back to stand beside her and reached for her hand. The double doors behind Callistos burst open. Hades strode in, his crimson cloak swirling around his ankles as the pointed tips of his metal boots scraped the wooden floor. His blue eyes sought Keras. "The gate has moved." Hades made a beeline for his eldest son, and everyone parted to allow him through. His gaze scanned the map, and he leaned to his right and planted the sharp tip of one of his onyx talons into a realm far from the palace. "I have lured the gatekeeper away, and have summoned Thanatos Nyx and their allies." Hades wasn't messing around. Ares looked from the map to Keras. "You got this?" Keras nodded. "Remain here with Megan, Iko, and Ava." "Now hold on a minute." Ava's jaw-length black hair swayed outwards as she quickly spun to face Keras, a dark look entering her sapphire eyes. She palmed the gun she had been checking, looking for all the world as if she was considering using it on Keras. "I'm going too." Her gaze shifted to Valen, seeking backup. His expression softened as he stepped towards her, as he lifted his hand and went to touch her face. She backed off a step, hitting him with a scowl. "You dare!" "Baby," he started. Don't you baby me!" She moved back another step and his face crumpled, a war taking place in his golden eyes as he stared at her. He was right to force her to remain behind with Ares and the others. Ava was strong, for a human, and skilled, but this was a fight for immortals. Ava would be a liability out on the battlefield, a distraction for everyone on their side. Everyone would want to protect her for Valen, and that could prove disastrous. "Stronzo," Ava muttered, some of the fight leaving her as she continued to stare at him. He smiled slightly. "You know me, always a dickhead. Don't make me lock you in a room or some shit. Please?" Her slight shoulders sagged. He would do it. Enyo could see that. Valen ran a hand over his violet hair and then held it out to her. "I just need to know you're safe. You can hate me all you want. I probably deserve it. Hell, I'd rather you hate me for a year than see you out there in the thick of things for even a second. I want you by my side, you know that. But I need to know you're safe and you won't be safe out there." Her black eyebrows furrowed, hurt glittering in her blue eyes. She was silent for a long time and then finally murmured, "Promise me you'll be careful." "I swear it. You know me, always careful." Valen smiled tightly. Ares chuckled, the warm sound out of place in the moment. "She knows you, and that's why she's asking you to be careful, idiot." Valen huffed and glared at him. "I'll keep an eye on him," Merrick offered. "We'll keep an eye on him." Katerina looped her arm around Merrick's. He nodded and petted her hand, briefly looked as if he wanted to order her to remain at Keras's house too. The look the hybrid female issued him said it wasn't going to happen. "Someone has to protect Megan and Milos." Cassandra's pale blue eyes shone with fire, flakes of it dancing amidst the icy color of her irises, and the sense of power she emitted rose sharply as she stared at the point Hades' talons had marked on the map. A low grunting growl came from the direction of the fireplace. Everyone looked there. Milos cracked an eye open and looked at Cass, shuffled until his back was to her, and used his large tawny feathered wings to hide everyone's view of his face. His tail twitched, the furry tip thudding against the floor. The guardian deity wasn't happy about being left behind. Cass went to him, eased into a crouch, and tried to pet him, but he lifted his huge head and bared his yellowing fangs at her, making the sorceress look like an old-fashioned lion tamer as she held her hand out in front of her. "We talked about this," she murmured, staring into his golden eyes. "I know you'll come if I need you, but I want you to stay here and protect Aiko and Megan and the others. You don't want your girlfriends getting into trouble, do you?" Ares muttered something about being adequate protection for the women. Milos looked past his flattened wings to the females Cass had mentioned, a calculating edge to his eyes. He pushed onto his feet, a great hulking beast that made Cass look tiny, and strode towards Aiko. He shifted as he walked to her, his wings shrinking into his back and white fur spotting him in places as he transformed back into a small domestic cat. When his transformation was complete, he leaped at Aiko. She caught him and hugged him close as he purred, stroked his head and smiled up at Escher as he gazed down at her, looking somewhere between lovesick and sick with worry. "Be careful," she whispered and angled her head up, closed her eyes as he dropped a kiss on her lips, earning a growl and a hiss from Milos. Apparently, the guardian deity was very serious about protecting his girlfriends. He went as far as swiping with claws out at Escher when he pulled back. "Little prick," Escher muttered with a glare at the cat. "Don't think I didn't notice the presents you've been leaving all over the Zen garden." Escher sobered and looked at Keras. "The Zen garden?" A hopeful edge laced that question. "It was mostly intact when we left." Keras rounded the table and gripped Escher's shoulder. "Any damage that has happened to the mansion can be reversed. Cass has already confirmed that." Hades' blue eyes landed on Escher. "If you win this war, then you will not need to return to the mortal realm. Whether the mansion is repairable matters not in that case." The look Escher gave their father said it all. He wasn't planning on staying in the underworld. A few of the brothers exchanged glances, looks that revealed they were considering the same thing. Enyo could understand Valen wishing to continue living in the mortal world, since Ava was human and was very determined to carry on with her work as an assassin. She could understand Callistos' decision to return there too, since Miranda had spoken several times about completing her education to honor her father, something that had only improved Enyo's good opinion of the Fury. But Escher surprised her. He despised humans, and with good reason. The thought that he would want to continue living in the mortal realm, subjecting himself to them when his history with them made it difficult for him to be near them, physically and mentally pained him, made no sense to her at all. Escher's blue eyes drifted to Aiko, lingered on her as she petted Milos. Her dark gaze lifted from the cat to lock with Escher's, and a hint of crimson climbed her cheeks. Perhaps it was a combination of things that had Escher wanting to go back to the mansion when the war was over. His love for his home and his love for Aiko, and possibly a desire to overcome his past so he could erase the hate he felt towards humans and could grow to like them, just as he had grown to love Aiko. Escher and Valen would need to visit the underworld regularly with their women, staying periods of time in this realm to be near Persephone and Hades, so Aiko and Ava would eventually absorb the power those within their sphere were exposed to, a power that would render them immortal too. The effect would weaken in the mortal world, slowly pushing them back towards being human, but a stay in this realm would strengthen it again. The brothers filed from the room one by one, those who were remaining behind moving to an area of comfortable seating and beginning to talk. Enyo looked across her shoulder at Keras. He squeezed her hand. "We should prepare." She had brought her armor with her and had stored it in his room, on a stand next to his. A trickle of nerves, or possibly excitement, ran through her as he led her upstairs as they dressed in silence. War. She could feel it already, brewing inside her, rousing her battle instincts. It was hard to tame the wild need to surge onto the battlefield right that second, with or without the brothers and their women, with or without the allies Hades had called upon. She took her sword from the stand and fixed it to her belt, drew the weapon and stared at it as it caught the light and shone at her. Hunger raged through her, pushed her. Keras's gauntleted left hand came to rest on her right one, and she tore her gaze from the blade, lifting it to lock with his green eyes. They shone with amusement and a hint of fear. "This is a scouting mission first and foremost. We do not know what to expect." She nodded and sheathed her sword, reined in her urges and tried to tamp down her instincts. It was hard when those instincts hummed in her veins, filled her with a buzz that had her raring to go. "We will observe the gate from a vantage point and see what we are up against before we do anything. Do you understand?" Keras's firm tone had her nodding, battling with herself to soothe the need to fight. He was right. They had to go about this in a more tactical fashion. Their forces were limited, and there was a chance that the Fury who had captured Miranda had joined with Nemesis and the army she had been amassing in secret. The thought of fighting an entire legion only increased the excitement that flowed through her. She tried to hide it from Keras. Tried and failed, judging by how the corners of his sensual lips curled into the semblance of a smile, and amusement lit his eyes again. "It has been too long since I have fought by your side like this." He lifted his hand from hers and slid it along her jaw, gazed down into her eyes as his grew hooded and his voice lowered. "All those wars we fought in centuries ago, and before every single one, I wanted to kiss you. I ached for it. A slave to the fear I might be struck down and never know the taste of these lips." He rubbed the pad of his thumb over her lower lip, the cool kiss of metal sending a shiver down her spine that ignited her blood. Enyo tilted her head up, as eager for his kiss now as he had been to kiss her back then. She had never feared battle, never feared dying. Now a sliver of her heart feared both of those things, because she feared being parted from Keras again. He dropped his head and kissed her, his lips softly dancing over hers, pouring warmth through her that chased the cold fear away and had strength flowing into her again. Nothing would part them. She would make sure of that. He gathered her to him and teleported. Warm wind buffeted her, and she broke the kiss and looked down into the valley far below her, at the blonde female who pulled an unwilling Miranda towards the gate, flanked by 4 Valkyries and defended by 6 of the huge demonic males they had battled in the mortal world. A force Enyo and her side could easily contend with now the brothers didn't have to wear their limiters, and Hades' allies would be joining them in the fight. This was going to be almost too easy. Keras grabbed her arm and yanked her down into a squat beside him on the bluff, and she frowned as she glanced at him and found him staring not at the Fury and her group, but beyond them. Ennio looked there and cursed. There had to be close to 200 males and females gathered between the gate and the Fury, and the one who stood just in front of them told Ennio they weren't there to protect it. They were there to breach it. Nemesis. Chapter 26. Keras lunged for Cal and grabbed his arm, exerted his will, and stopped his youngest brother from teleporting. Cal turned stormy wild eyes on him, the wind that chased around him building as Valen seized him too, and Escher moved to block his view of the valley. I know you need to go to Morinda, but to rush headlong into battle without a plan would be foolish. Keras had wanted to say reckless, something Cal was most days, but his brother had been working hard to curb that trait of his, had grown more mature and serious in the weeks since he had met Morinda. Plus, Keras could understand his brother's desperate need to launch into action. He looked down into the valley at the gathering force. If it had been Ennio down there, held captive by his enemy, he would have stepped straight to her too, would have shunned all reason to reach her and free her, to have her back in his arms. We just need to assess what we're up against, Escher whispered with a glance at the valley bottom. Steep mountains surrounded it on all sides, jagged and black, fractures in their faces bleeding lava that turned the sky orange and heated the air. This part of the underworld was still forming, pushing back the boundaries of the realm to expand it. Every year the realm grew in size, land masses growing to eat away at the abyss. Keras had tried to grasp the science of it once and had only come away with a headache. Mortals viewed the universe as ever-expanding into nothingness. The underworld was going through the same process. Entire regions had been formed in his lifetime, areas as vast as a continent. The valley stretched at least 2 miles long, with a flat bottom shaped like the tip of a spear. At the point of it, the gate shimmered, the colorful rings bright against the black rock as they rotated horizontally above it. Unlike the gates in the mortal realm, the ones in the underworld were always visible but locked. As it stood, the gate was safe, but that would all change if the Fury reached it with Morinda. They would be able to use the powers they had siphoned from him and his brothers to open that gate and form the link between the underworld and Tokyo. Once the gate was open, they would attempt to shatter it, damaging it in a way that would force it to remain open long enough for the two realms to collide and bleed together. All Keras' side needed to do was stop them from reaching the gate, which sounded far easier than he knew it was going to be. Nemesis had gathered a strong force. Even at this distance, he could sense the strength of some of them, and the power the scarlet-haired goddess emitted had grown stronger too. It slithered over his skin like an oily slick, a disturbing sensation that made him want to rub his arms to rid himself of it. Had she grown stronger because the belief of the males and females she had convinced to join her side was fueling her? Or had she always been this strong, but something about her realm had kept her power limited? It wouldn't surprise Keras if his father had tampered with the laws of her realm to keep her power in check. Valen released Cal when he nodded, his black gauntleted hand slipping from his wrist. It was strange to see all his brothers garbed for war, wearing the same red-edged onyx armor as he did. Like him, they had omitted their crimson cloak, though. War was no place for something the enemy could easily grab and use against you. Keras flexed the scarlet tips of his gauntlets against Cal's wrist and then released him. A mistake. Callistos disappeared in a swirl of black smoke. Damn him, Diamond muttered. Little fucker, Valen bit out. Keras echoed both of those sentiments. He fixed his gaze on Morinda and stepped, trusting that his brothers and Ennio would follow him. He had wanted to wait for Thanatos and Nyx to arrive with their army, but that was no longer an option. He couldn't leave Callistos to fend for himself, and his gut said his brother was about to land in a whole heap of trouble. Keras appeared in the middle of pandemonium, was struck by wind the second he touched down, and sent flying into one of the enormous demonic males. The male grunted, and his scarlet eyes widened as he shoved Keras off him, realization dawning in them. The demon lunged for him instead, and Keras was swift to leap backwards, barely avoiding being grabbed. A pretty blonde female crashed into the male, The swirls and spikes of the dark gold metal bikini she wore barely covering her breasts and the juncture of her thighs, revealing far more than was decent. A Valkyrie. Fire lit her golden eyes as she turned with a snarl on Callistos, shoved off the demon and knocked him down as she sprang back towards his brother. She was little more than a blur as she launched at him, her half-leather, half-feather wings beating the air, and her clawed talons reaching for him. Diamond appeared in her path and grabbed her by her throat. She hissed and kicked at him as ice spread over her tanned skin, flashing sharp teeth in his face. His white-haired brother didn't flinch as she railed, as her golden boots connected hard with his shins and her talons raked over his black armor. He closed his hand around her throat and white spread up his black gauntlets, formed spikes of ice along his forearm that glittered in the amber light from the lava flowing down the mountains. "Any idea what her charm is?" Diamond flicked a glance at Keras as he dodged left, avoiding a blow the demon brute aimed at him. He launched his shadows at the male, tearing a roar from him as they engulfed him. "No idea." But she would have one. All Valkyries had a charm they wore, an enchantment that protected her and made it impossible to kill her. Before he could scan her for something that looked out of place, the other 3 Valkyries shot down from the sky and attacked Diamond as one. Cassandra bit out something in Russian and struck one with a sphere of violet light that sent her shooting back into the air. She hurled another spell at Diamond, and a thin blue barrier appeared around him in a wave, knocking all the Valkyries back and forcing the one he had been holding away from him. It severed the arm of one of the Valkyries. The sorceress grinned. It fell from her face when Diamond spoke. "Only gonna slow her down." Cassandra's pale blue eyes widened as the blonde female beat her wings, the golden feathers at the tops of them shimmering in the light as she lifted into the air, and her arm regrew. The female flexed her new talons and grinned down at Cass, flashing sharp teeth in her direction. On an ear-splitting shriek, the Valkyrie launched towards her. Keras swept his arm up and hit her with a wave of shadows before she could reach Cass, knocking her flying back into the air again. She struck one of the other Valkyries, and both of them turned on him with a hiss. White-purple lightning blinded him as it shot down from the sky and hit one of them. She screamed and shuddered, her entire body juddering as arcs of electricity coursed over her. Valen aimed the next bolt of lightning at her companion, but the female was swift to move, hit the speed of a train as she beat her wings and swept over the battlefield in a broad arc. Keras tracked her. As his gaze followed her, the force Nemesis had amassed reached them, and several of them went down screaming, clutching their chests and vomiting blood. Escher. "Do not overdo it." Keras turned on his brother. Escher's blue eyes narrowed on him, and he looked as if he wanted to refuse that order, but then he nodded stiffly. Escher's power over water gave him the ability to control the fluid within another person's body, but it drained him. Using that attack too much would render him weak and vulnerable. Merrick joined the fray with Katerina, cutting through the gathered hellspawn and other species who had sided with Nemesis. The blood from the ones Escher had taken down rose into the air, fist-sized spheres of it that rippled as they obeyed Escher's command. They were still a moment, and then shot towards the bulk of the enemy forces, splitting into smaller spheres along the way. Those bullet-sized balls of blood ripped through the enemy, punching holes in the ones who were too slow to dodge. Trusting that his brothers had this, Keras glanced at Enyo, and caught her looking at his wrists as she battled one of the demonic brutes. She didn't have to worry. He was more than powerful enough to deal with any from the enemy's side, even Nemesis. Enyo bent forwards to duck beneath the meaty fist of the demon and straightened, leaned back immediately to avoid the leathery wing that cut across the air in front of her, her jade eyes widening as it came close to striking her. Keras sent a wave of shadows at the demon just as Enyo drew her blade. The silver sword shone in a dazzling arc as she dropped to a crouch as the male twisted back towards her, lashing at her with his claws. She sliced across the demon's shins. A frustrated bellow erupted from the brute, and she threw herself forwards and rolled as the male tried to stomp on her. Keras's shadows barreled into the male's foot before he could bring it down and shoved upwards, flipping the demon into the air. Enyo rolled onto her feet in front of Keras and glanced around them at the battle. "It seems to be going well." Famous last words if ever he heard them. A roar off to his right had his focus zooming there, and he glared at the 2 demons who had managed to get their hands on Cal. His brother fought like a wild thing, battering them with blasts of wind that almost managed to free him, his stormy eyes fixed ahead of him on Meadow as two more of the demonic males dragged Mirinda along behind her. Cal hit his captors with another blast of wind, and one of them lost his grip on him. A Valkyrie seized Cal from behind, her golden talons pressing into his throat and spilling blood down his black armor. Keras stepped with a growl that echoed through the brief flare of darkness around him and summoned his shadows, pulling them from that darkness. He blasted out of the teleport close to the Valkyrie, the shadows that had been rising up behind him shooting past him as his boots hit the black basalt. They tore into the Valkyrie, their hunger echoing inside Keras as they swarmed around her, lashing and cutting her, feeding on her panic. He didn't have to know what her charm was if his shadows ripped at everything she wore. Eventually they would find it and break it, and then they would break her. Keras swiftly blocked the fist of one of the two demons as it flew at his face, grabbed it with his other hand and twisted, slamming the male onto his back on the black ground. He dropped hard, landing with his knee on the demonic male's throat, and punched him, once, twice, a third time. Glyphs shimmered over his skin each time, but the percussion caused by his rapid hits was enough to cause some damage. Blood burst from the male's lips, the smell of the fetid black liquid rousing rage in Keras's veins, rage that demanded he surrender to it and destroy everyone present for daring to enter his father's realm, sullying it with their presence. Rage that demanded he deal with the traitors by gutting them, using the entrails from one to strangle the next, a fitting punishment for what they had done. Enyo's bright silver blade cut up the back of the second demon, and his furious bellow as she caught his wings satisfied the rage building inside Keras, bringing it back down to a more manageable level. He fought to suppress it further as he raked talons over the throat of the demon he had pinned beneath him, but it spiked again as glyphs appeared in a wave over the demon's skin. The protection spells needed to go. "Cassandra!" Keras bellowed. Diamond appeared with her a few seconds later, his brothers swift to spin her away from him when the demon Enyo had been fighting made a lunge for her. Diamond took the blow, staggered backwards as the male's fist slammed into his chest. Ice spikes erupted from the ground between them, shattered as they struck the male's skin rather than piercing it. "Damn it," Diamond muttered. "We really need to do something about these bastards. Baby?" "Working on it." Cass sounded strained. Keras looked up at her where she stood over the demon, her hands moving slowly and rhythmically between her and the demon, who looked up at her too, his crimson eyes growing wider by the second. Ribbons of colorful light formed between her fingertips and the demon's chest, dancing in the air, undulating and twisting, growing brighter as Cass's eyes fell shut and she wavered on her feet. Enyo barreled into the demon that Diamond had been fighting, taking him off his brother's hands just as Cass's legs gave out. Diamond caught her and held her up, his black armor blending with her leathers and corset, and the tumbling waves of her hair as she leaned her head back against his chest. "You good?" She nodded and swallowed, some of her color returning as Diamond held her. "I know this spell. I did not cast it, so I cannot reverse it. Piecing together a counterspell for it now." Beneath Keras's knee, the demon struggled, his desperate actions jostling Keras as he tried to keep him pinned. It seemed he didn't want to lose the spell that was protecting him. Enyo and the other demon danced back into view, her blade glancing off his skin as the male blocked her with his bare arms. Glyphs shone wherever she struck, her face a picture of growing determination as she narrowed her jade eyes on the male and hit harder, putting all of her strength behind her next blow. A wave of dazzling crimson and aqua light burst outwards from Cass. Enyo's sword cleaved right through the arm of the demon as the spell passed through him and sliced at a diagonal into his chest, from his shoulder to his heart. The huge demonic male looked down, his scarlet eyes wide, shock washing across his rough features. He lifted his one remaining hand, didn't make it as far as touching the wound. He fell to his knees and crumpled, the action yanking Enyo forwards as her sword went with him. Keras stared at the dead male. Cassandra's counterspell hadn't only made the demon beneath him vulnerable as Keras had expected, it had made all of the Fury's bodyguards vulnerable. He didn't take his eyes off the dead demon as his shadows tore through the one beneath him. The Valkyrie his shadows had been attacking suddenly screamed and then went silent. He looked over his shoulder at her as his shadows flowed away from her, tendrils of them snaking across the ground and seeking their next victim. 2 demons and 1 Valkyrie down. They could do this. He looked up at Enyo. roared as a thin rope of silver wrapped around her neck and she shot backwards. The horde of males and females who were on the enemy's side swallowed her, stealing her from view, tearing another feral bellow from him as his darker side surged to the fore, snarled at him to find her, protect her, because Nemesis had her. He barely spared a glance at Cal, looked at him for just long enough to see that he was fine, and that Diamond and Cass had joined him, together with Escher. Keras kicked off and teleported, growled as he landed in the middle of the enemy forces, the darkness inside him building faster as a muffled grunt reached his ears. Enyo. Lightning struck around him as he tore through the hellspawn between him and her, lashing at them with his talons and his shadows. The white-purple bolts hit hard and fast in a line, and Keras silently thanked Valen for helping him as they cleared him a path. A pained grunt burst from his lips as a Valkyrie slammed into his right side, knocking him into a group of males and taking him down. They leaped on him and he curled up, defending himself as best he could with his shadows and his armor, deflecting blows from both blades and fists. The darkness surged deeper this time, seemed to sink into his veins, down into his bones, and black needs filled him, spun around his mind in a twisted, pleasing spiral that had him falling deeper into the abyss. "Keras!" Merrick bellowed. Around him, shards of black earth shot up, ripping pained screams from both the hellspawn males and the Valkyrie. Keras was quick to launch to his feet again, made a mental note to thank his brother later as he threw his hand forward and sliced through the wall of earth that protected him with his shadows, cleaving a great hole in it, and the enemy on the other side. Several of the males went down. He stepped through the hole and scanned the battlefield, seeking Enyo. Merrick and Katerina fought nearby, tackling the Valkyrie who had attacked Keras, taking her and her small group of males on with blades and spears of earth. Keras looked left, snarled as he caught a glimpse of Scarlet. Nemesis. A flash of silver followed, together with a battle cry that roused his blood, had his heart pumping harder as adrenaline surged. Enyo. He tried to step to her and growled when his head turned, warning him that teleporting would be a mistake. He couldn't afford to pass out on the battlefield. He would have to reach her through other means. A grin stretched his lips, splitting a cut on his lower one. His shadows shot forwards, a seething mass of spikes that snapped at and pierced any who lingered in their way. Keras followed behind them, sprinting towards Enyo, his gaze locked on her. He caught glimpses of her as she battled Nemesis near the gate, a gate which shone brightly, rainbow colors chasing across its surface as he neared it. He skidded to a halt. Damn it. If he went any closer, the gate would open. He wouldn't get a say in it either. He could try to control it, but it would take effort and focus, far more than he would have as he tried to battle Nemesis. It had to be her plan. She had used her whip to snatch Enyo in order to draw him to the gate. He cursed again, spitting the foulest one he knew in the language of the underworld. This wasn't good. He blocked the blade that came flying at him, deflecting it with his vambrace and ducking left, leaning to avoid being cut by it. Another male thrust a dagger at him, and Keras bared his fangs and hit him with his shadows. The thin tendrils pierced his chest and came out the other side, wrapped around him and dragged him down. Strength flowed through Keras as his shadows devoured the traitor. Some of these hellspawn were strong. If he could kill enough of them and feed them to his shadows, he might be strong enough to control the gate and fight Nemesis at the same time. It was a good plan, the best one he had. He turned to call out to Valen and Merrick. Heat bloomed in his shoulder. He looked down at it, at the silver barb that protruded from it. "Keras!" Enyo screamed. He grunted as he shot backwards towards her, the pain in his shoulder blazing outwards, as the 4 points at the base of the tip of Nemesis's whip dug through his armor and into his flesh. Not good. If Nemesis managed to get him near the gate, it would open. She would win. Chapter 27. A ripe curse spilled from Nemesis as Keras's back slammed into something solid. A wall? "I'd expected more from the firstborn of Hades." Thanatos' deep voice rumbled against Keras's back. Relief flooded him. Pain followed it as Thanatos grabbed the tip of Nemesis's whip and yanked it forwards, tugging it from Keras's shoulder. He threw his head back and unleashed an agonized bellow as fire swept through him, his mind blanking as his ears rang and his heart labored. The pain only grew more intense as the god of death crushed the barbed tip in his gauntleted fist and grabbed the silver metal rope of the whip in his other hand and broke it. Thanatos discarded the barb and released the main length of the whip. Keras sank against Thanatos' front, his breath sawing from his lips as he struggled against the fierce waves of fire crashing over him. Thanatos gripped his left shoulder and pushed him forwards, and bile rose up Keras' throat as the whip slid free of his right shoulder. "Enyo," Keras muttered, mustering his strength and battling the pain, aware that he couldn't afford to rest. He had to reach Enyo. "Taken care of. Mother is in a bad mood." Thanatos chuckled. It was just like the brutal god of death to laugh on the battlefield. Keras had never fought beside the towering male before, but his father had told him stories of their battles together, and of his battles with Nyx at his side. He turned slowly, coming to face the 7-foot-plus wall of muscle. As always, Thanatos wore black armor only on his lower half and his forearms, leaving the heavy ropes of muscle of his torso exposed. Hades had asked the god of death about his habit of foregoing chest armor in the past, and the black-haired male had blamed his wings. Keras had to agree with his father's theory. Thanatos liked all on the battlefield to see his strength and not just feel it. Amusement shone in the male's silver eyes as he glanced at the battle, and his huge onyx-feathered wings shifted as he turned slightly to block a male who swung a sword at him, the change in his position revealing the gate. And Nyx. The beautiful, slender female fought fiercely, her navy-to-aqua eyes shining with a battle high as she worked in tandem with Enyo. Both goddesses moved as one, as if they had practiced this fight 1,000 times, their silver swords cutting through the air towards Nemesis. The scarlet-haired goddess lashed out at them with her whip, striking both of their swords, knocking them back as she inched away from them. Her blood-red sandals scraped over the loose ground, her scarlet eyes leaping between Nyx and Enyo as she readied her whip again. The sheer layers of her black dress parted to flash her thighs as she hurled her whip forwards, her face twisting in a sneer as Enyo batted it away again and advanced. Determination flashed in Enyo's jade eyes, and gods, she had never looked so beautiful. Keras tackled another male who dared to attack him and Thanatos, cutting him down as the god of death went to town on another group, his enormous black broadsword making easy work of even the stronger hellspawn. Together they cut a path through the throng, heading for Nyx and Enyo. Two of the surviving demonic males and a Valkyrie joined Nemesis. The shift in favor towards Nemesis didn't deter either Enyo or Nyx. Nyx's flowing black hair lifted into the air as she gracefully spun away from the Valkyrie, the silver threads in it catching the colorful light of the gate. The light chased over her alabaster skin, painting it with soft hues, and glinted off the swirls of silver-blue metal that formed a breastplate over her long black dress. The sheer layers of it split at the front, flashing her long legs as she dropped beneath the blade the Valkyrie aimed at her throat. Enyo struck that blade with her own, knocking it upwards, sending the blonde female off balance. A petite raven-haired female dressed in a gold and black breastplate and skirt leaped on the Valkyrie's back and drove 2 gold daggers into her shoulders. Iris. Apparently, Thanatos wasn't the only child Nyx had brought with her into battle. The diminutive goddess of strife was vicious as she clung to the hilt of one dagger and drew the other out of the Valkyrie's shoulder. She stabbed the female again, driving the blade into her neck this time. Blood spurted from beneath the dagger, splattering across Iris's face and soaking into her twisted braids, turning the threads of gold in them scarlet. Her amber eyes brightened as she struck again. And again. The Valkyrie didn't stand a chance. A golden black spear pierced her side, and a high battle cry reached Keras's ears as the one who wielded it drove forwards. Iris scrambled up onto the Valkyrie's shoulders, gripping her wings to avoid being skewered by the deadly tip of the spear as it punched out of the female's back. "Watch it!" Iris snarled. Apate just grinned at her, a wicked twinkle in her sky-blue eyes as she brushed loose auburn hair back from her face, tucking it behind the thick plait that arced up from her temple to a knot in the back of her head that held the rest of her hair in place. That hair turned jet black, her eyes following it as her grin widened and she looked at the 2 male demons now closing ranks with Nemesis. The colorful sash that hung from her waist, cinching her short black robe in, shone brightly. The demonic brutes halted and slowly turned to look at each other. Keras wasn't surprised when they launched into a fierce battle against each other, rather than moving to defend Nemesis. Pleasure flitted across Apate's face as she pulled her spear free and watched them fight. The goddess of deceit always had loved turning allies against each other. Thanatos spun with Keras, swinging his broadsword at the same time, and Keras released his shadows, smiled as they tore through a female and took her down. He worked with the god of death, keeping his back to the male as they slowly moved towards Nemesis and the others. When an opening appeared in the fray, he quickly scanned the battlefield, locating his brothers. Merrick and Katerina fought back-to-back like him and Thanatos, and both had sustained injuries. Valen fought near them, blood dripping down the side of his face from a jagged cut across his forehead. Escher and Cal were working together, battling a Valkyrie that was blocking their path to Mirinda. Mirinda had managed to get free and was fighting Meadow now, her violet eyes shining brightly as she viciously grappled with the other Fury. Cass and Diamond were ripping through the other remaining Valkyrie and a demon, striking both with spells and ice, barraging them and driving them towards Valen and Merrick. Keras twisted with Thanatos again and ducked as an arrow whizzed past his head and almost struck the god of death. Thanatos was quick to shift to his left, though, the arrow flying harmlessly past him to clatter across the black ground. "Sorry," a soft female voice called. Keras shook his head as his gaze landed on the youthful goddess, desperately trying to tell her to keep her distance. Oisis bounced up to him regardless, all light with her bright blue eyes and shining halo of pale gold hair that had been styled around half a polished silver and blue Corinthian helmet that sat at an angle on top of her head. The moment she neared him, a heaviness rolled through him, all thoughts about the fact they were clearly going to win this battle turning to doubts. "God, sister, move away," Thanatos grumbled, and leveled a black look on her, blue fire flickering in his silver eyes as he grabbed a male by his head and closed his fist, crushing his skull. "My thoughts are dark enough as it is." The goddess of misery pouted. "Come, sister." Moros, a towering male with black hair that bled to crimson at the tips and eerie violet eyes, took hold of her arm with one hand and flexed the fingers of his other one around the hilt of his sword. Rumors had always surrounded the two, tales that only the god of impending doom could withstand her presence without succumbing to depression. She flicked another longing look at her older brother Thanatos, before sighing and allowing herself to be led away by Moros. The highly polished silver shield on her back acted like a mirror, and Keras tried to convince himself not to look into it, because it always showed a darker version of the world, including whoever was reflected in it. He caught a glimpse of himself as he averted his gaze. Crimson eyes stared back at him, but other than that, he appeared the same. He wasn't sure that was a good thing. Oisis calmly nocked an arrow and loosed it. It nailed a hellspawn over 100 meters away in his head. Moros said something to her, and she smiled brightly at him. Keras left them to it. He mustered his strength as Enyo launched herself at Nemesis, and the goddess readied her whip, brought it back and struck hard. It caught Enyo's side, and her jade eyes glittered with pain as she pushed forwards, raising her sword. He stepped and appeared before Nemesis, grabbed her and spun her to face him as his shadows shot outwards from under his boots. They were swift to seize hold of the goddess. "Traitor!" he snarled, all the time she had punished him or one of his brothers flooding his mind, stoking the rage that flowed through him. "You will answer to my father for what you have done." To his left, the gate shone in a wave of color, and the power of it hummed in his veins. Nemesis looked at it, a rainbow reflecting in her crimson eyes as she gazed at the rings of the gate. It was opening. She brought her arm up and looped her whip around his neck, gripped the other end of it and dragged him forwards. Her forehead cracked against his, pain spiderwebbing over his skull as his ears rang again. "This is not over," she hissed in his face and kneed him in the stomach. "We will be the victors." Keras growled and commanded his shadows, savored her shriek as they twisted tightly around her legs, and 1,000 thorns erupted from them to pierce her flesh. The scent of blood filled the air, goading the darkness as it rose within him again. He snarled as he seized hold of her throat with his right hand and shoved her backwards, wrestling with himself to resist the urge to strike her down as punishment for what she had done. His father would want her alive so he could make an example of her. As much as he wanted to kill her, he had to take her to his father. He kept telling himself that as he squeezed her throat, as he stared into her wild scarlet eyes as panic filled them. Cold darkness coiled inside him, seeped into his veins, and whispered words of seduction in his ear, words that had him tightening his grip, relishing the fear that built in her eyes as she struggled for air. He wanted her dead. She had to die. On a vicious roar, he unleashed his shadows. They burrowed into Nemesis, appearing as jagged black lines beneath her flesh that rapidly spread as she tossed her head back and screamed. When the tips of the tendrils of shadows reached her chest, that scream died on her lips, and she died with it. Keras stared at her, pleasure rolling through him, satisfaction beating in every inch of him as he realized she was gone. She had paid for her crime against his family, for her betrayal and her plot against his realm. Justice had been served. He dropped her and she crumpled on the ground, the shadows bleeding out of her pores to pool on the black earth beneath her. "Keras," Enyo whispered. His head jerked up, his eyes darting to her where she stood just beyond Nemesis, with her hand pressed to her side. The urge to go to her was too strong to resist, the need to know she would be all right consuming and controlling him. He stepped over Nemesis's body and placed his gauntleted hand over hers. Her jade eyes remained fixed on his chest, on Nemesis where she lay behind him. Dead. He knew what she wanted to say, knew that he should have spared Nemesis so his father could deal with her, but he hadn't been able to stop himself. A commotion behind Enyo caught his eye, and he glared at Meadow as the blonde female made a break for it, heading for the gate. He couldn't let her reach the other side. He stepped around Enyo and rushed forwards, moving to intercept the Fury, an easy task given that she was still over 100 feet from the gate. His eyes widened as he noticed that she wasn't heading for the gate. She was heading for a portal between her and it. The violet-black oval blended with the terrain, visible only because of the sparks of green and purple lightning that chased over its surface. Cal sprinted after her, hot on her heels. His youngest brother's blonde hair streamed behind him as he leaped over fallen hellspawn, hitting the black dirt on the other side without losing his balance. Cal hurled his right hand forwards, and wind blasted the bodies in his path, scattering them and leaving a clear run at Meadow. The Fury glanced over her shoulder, panic shining in her tropical blue eyes. Keras shifted course, banking right and heading for her, determined to stop her from reaching the portal and escaping. She had been in contact with his brothers, would have the power to open the gate for weeks. She would have enough time to muster her forces again, or make another attempt to get her hands on Miranda or Cassandra. If she managed to capture Cassandra, she might be able to raise her fallen comrades, using necromancy to restore them. Keras wasn't about to let that happen. He was going to capture her, not only because he didn't want her escaping, but because he wanted to hand her over to his father. Hades could make an example of her. Keras focused to step and grab her. Cal launched another attack, and his brother's blue eyes widened as instead of scattering the bodies and clearing his path, the blade of air sliced right through them, and right through Meadow as she leaped for the portal. Cal skidded to a halt, and Keras stumbled to a stop, both of them staring at Meadow as she fell into the portal, in two pieces. The swirling violet-black cloud shrank as Keras stared at it, shock running through him. Miranda hurried to Callistos, said something Keras didn't hear as she continued to stare at where the portal had been. Merrick helped Katerina, his arm around her waist to support her as she hobbled towards Keras. Blood tracked down Merrick's thigh from a dent in his armor, but his brother was more concerned about her injuries than his own, his earthy eyes fixed on her hip. Cass rushed to her, and colorful light shone from her palm as she ghosted it over Katerina's wound. "Thanks," Katerina wheezed and gave Merrick a look, one that clearly told him to stop fussing. She had no hope of that happening. Diamond received the same look from Cass as he caught up with her, as he touched a cut on her cheek and his pale blue eyes warmed with worry. Valen and Escher made their way towards him too, both of them covered in black blood. Valen lowered his head, his violet hair falling forwards to obscure his face, as he fingered a hole in his armor above his left hip. "Shit was a close call. Bastard went right from my heart," he grumbled and looked at Oisis as she strolled beside him with her brother Moros. "Cheers, little Miss Dreary. You're a damned good shot with that thing." He jerked his chin towards the bow she gripped. She shrugged and smiled. Enyo joined Keras and looked him over, concern shining in her jade eyes. "I'm fine." He gave her a slow once-over. "You?" She nodded and looked at the dead that surrounded them. "Is it over?" He surveyed the battlefield, his gaze lingering on Thanatos as the towering god stooped and picked up Nemesis's body, and Nyx led Eris and Apate in rounding up the survivors. A gift for his father, but not the one he had really wanted to give him. Nemesis's body and the 30 or so hellspawn who had survived would have to do. He was sure his father was going to enjoy holding them in Tartarus for the rest of their lives. Thanatos brought Nemesis to him, and he took her from the god of death. Looked down at her ashen, blood-splattered face. He had been fighting this war for 200 years. "It's over." He didn't hear the congratulations that passed between Nyx and her children and his brothers. He continued to stare at Nemesis, the weight that had been on his shoulders slowly lifting as he kept telling himself it was finally over. His duty was done. And rather than stepping into the abyss as he had been contemplating, he had a future to look forward to with the only woman he had ever loved. Enyo took hold of him and teleported, and when they touched down, he stood before the great black temple of the palace. His father stood at the edge of the raised base near the steps, flanked by the huge onyx columns that supported the triangular roof. His mother stood beside him, the soft waves of her scarlet hair a contrast to his father's armor, as she looped her arm around his and leaned towards him, and her green eyes shining with warmth as she looked at Keras. Keras sensed everyone appearing behind him, looked deep into his father's blue eyes and strode forwards, leaving them behind and approaching him alone. Persephone released Hades, and he slowly descended the black steps, his heavy crimson cloak flowing over them behind him as the pointed tips of the obsidian boots of his armor scraped against the marble. She followed him down, flowers blooming around her bare feet as they touched the earth. Keras laid Nemesis down on the ground before his father and stood, waited. His father's blue eyes warmed, filled with something that warmed Keras too, sank deep into his bones and eased all the tension from him as it flooded his heart with light, with pride. 2 words he had been waiting to hear for 2 centuries fell from his father's lips as he placed a hand on Keras's shoulder. Words that stirred a wealth of emotions in him that brought him close to tears. "Welcome home."